Hey, I'm streaming, just so you know. Don't say anything crazy.
Okay. All right, I'll put my pants back on.
Yeah, or just keep the camera pointed up.
By the way, before we start, can I ask you a question for my own safety?
For your own safety. Yeah, go
For
for it.
my own safety, yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Can you just tell me where you were physically on the date of January 6th, 2021?
The date of January 6, 2021. Is this a serious question or?
No, it's not a
Okay,
serious
I
question.
don't know how great. I think um, on January 6, 2021, I was
I was
ignoring.
making light of the idea that, people would have to like get a disclaimer from someone
No, I
to
know.
ensure they hadn't been there yet.
Yeah, I was actually sitting in my apartment ignoring a sponsored stream I was supposed to be doing because there was some crazy stuff going on at the Capitol. My sponsors were a little bit irked by that, but it was a big,
Yeah.
it was a big thing.
By the way, my audio's been a little choppy lately. I found that was maybe one of my problems yesterday on the stream
That
with
was
Mr.
definitely the
Ian.
problem for sure. That was, yeah,
Yeah.
that explains
So
everything.
if it sounds choppy, can you just let me know and like I'll try to troubleshoot it?
Yeah, for sure. I'll let you know.
Uh, Thanks. Yeah. So I
Um,
was more diligent than I normally am with these things, and responded to requests of followers to actually promote the link uh, on Twitter anyway prior to joining. So
nice. Okay, well, I real quick, do you want to introduce yourself to everybody before we get going, so they know who you
introduce
are? Whatever.
myself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gee, where do I begin? I don't know. Yeah, my name is Michael Tracey. Twitter M Tracy, Substack M Tracy.substack.com. Do journalism, commentary, writing, that sort of thing. Oh, on Call-in app as well, if people are interested. Interactive podcast app.
Gotcha. All right. Um, do you what? So I'm curious. How did the conversation with my good colleague and friend Vaush? How did that come about?
Are you colleagues, by the way? I don't know. I don't know the backstory to a lot of YouTube relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I actually worked at the Young Turks for a year and a half, 2017 to 2018, but it was sort of, it wasn't the most intuitively natural fit because it's not like I had aspired to be a YouTuber. I had like a side little YouTube channel that I did sometimes, but it wasn't like a main pursuit for me. But even having been on the Young Turks, I still didn't really find myself being particularly compelled to delve much into the YouTube. I don't know,
Gotcha.
minu cultural minutia. So I'm not familiar with your whatever relationship you might have had, or did or do or do not have with him.
It's long, complicated, sorted, not important. We're mortal
Okay,
enemies, but it is what it is.
okay. Well, how did it come about? Well, I did. I've done a quote unquote debate with him before. I'd never really approached these things as wanting to debate so much as like I'm like want to stand on a stage with a lectern or something and
Hmm.
abide by formal debate rules and then we poll the audience to see who's won or something. I just more I'll have a conversation more or less with anybody within reason, if they're asking me to do so. And it seems like there could be some value derived from it. So, yeah, in 2020,
Hmm.
he said on a stream that he would challenge me to come on to debate, and I would be too much of a wuss to do it, I guess. And so as it tends to happen, people who were watching, I guess, started sending me messages and asking me if I would be brave enough to come on the stream. So I said sure, and I did it. I think it was August of 2020. Yeah, and it was sort of a similar style of you know exchange where a lot of it somehow like boils down to him issuing me this like yes or no moral ultimatum,
Hmm.
and if I like request a sentence or two to elucidate the point I'm trying to get across, that means I'm dodging the question, and then that invites interruptions. And then if I try to override the interruptions to express the original point, then so it's always just a mess.
Sure.
And so just I guess this past week, a similar thing happened where people, followers of his, I guess, were, beckoning me to accept a challenge to debate specifically over the, Ukraine Russia stuff this
Hmm.
time. So I said, yeah, man, I'm as not particularly pleasant as it was the first time around. I'm still open-minded toward doing it. Mostly because the subject matter right now is of such grave important. So I'll put aside whatever personal reservations or the potential for like unpleasantness, and do it if it means maybe a subsection anyway of the audience could be exposed to some arguments or substantive points that they might not have heard otherwise. So that was my thinking, and then he signed on to it, and not really much more to it beyond that. Every once in a while he'll send me a snarky tweet about something or other, but I can't. I'm in no position to condemn that.
Sure, gotcha. Okay, gotcha. Would you, in terms of like overall like rough political leanings, how would you describe yourself?
Yeah. So as as I first became politically conscious, as like an adolescent, I just kind of instinctively identified with the Democratic Party. I'm still a registered Democrat now.
Okay.
Maybe more like the progressive end of the Democratic Party. That was just kind of my initial conception of what my political affiliation is. Over the years, especially within the past couple years, I've honestly, and again, I hope people don't assume this is a dodge and I'm like trying to conceal that I actually identify as a fascist or something, because it's not the case. Over the years, especially again as of late, I've become less and less wedded to just the mere kind of notion of trying to attach a kind of all-encompassing label to myself along those lines. I'm happy if people want to, ascribe one to me. I get called everything: left, right, center, up, down, right, left, etc. So I can't say that I have a fully kind of articulable sort of political ideology that would be conducive to a label at this point. Now, I mean, I'm happy to explain my views and positions on different things, or who I'm voting for or who I'm not voting for, like what my attitudes on a particular election. I guess, and I don't want to be like self-serving. I don't want to sound like highfalutin about it, but more and more what I'm interested in, as opposed to achieving any kind of like particular ideological or political or like activist objective, is that just doing what I can to like kind of just best depict reality like journalistically or analytically for people. So I guess that's sort of like my guiding impetus. And if it sounds pompous, okay, I mean, what do you want me to tell you? That's sort of, as best I can discern, that's sort of like the guiding politically oriented principle that I have in my brain at the moment.
Gotcha. Okay. So Vaush wanted to argue with you over stuff that was going on Twitter. What do you think yours and his main contention was about, related to, I'm guessing this is related to like Ukraine, yeah?
The main contention that he wanted to argue with me about, like ahead of time? Well, I mean, I'm sure it was some variation of, I'm a coward because I'm concealing that my true belief is that I support Russia, or even maybe that I'm paid by Russia, or again that I'm like a fascist, and that informs my support for Russia and hatred of Ukraine. That's the basic thrust of people who have like a suspicion of me vis-a-vis Ukraine. That tends to be more or less what they are trying to like kind of elicit me to admit. I don't know. Maybe there was something more specific that he would have wanted to nail me on. I'm not sure. I did go on a bit of a. I mean, I was going to say digression, but I actually don't think it was much of a digression, really, because there are really sort of potent relevancies. But I did go on a bit of a unusual. Down a bit of an unusual rabbit hole past maybe month or so, just on World War II stuff. Particularly as it relates to like the relevance to the contemporary debates, because the reason why I got into the World War II stuff is because anytime I anyway mention any aspect of like U.S. policy related to the Ukraine war or U.S. involvement, or really any facet of the issue, I just get inundated with these kind of flippant World War II analogies that are supposed to instruct me as to why I'm so wrong. Because if I knew what I was talking about, I would understand that the lessons of World War II demonstrate that interventionist policy measure X, Y, or Z
Mm-hmm.
that the U.S. might undertake in relation to Ukraine is not only justified, but like of utmost moral importance, just as it was of utmost moral importance for the U.S. to intervene in World War II and et cetera.
Yeah. So World War II and Iraq are like two things that I hear invoked over and over and over again. So if the U.S. is
Yeah,
ever going to get involved in a conflict, well, this is like Iraq. Or if the U.S. is going to get involved in a conflict, this is like stopping the Nazis. It seems like people will invoke these two things over and over again to whether they're trying to draw like the moral like weight of these conflicts in, or whether they're just trying to make them analogous one to one to argue for some strategic end or whatever. Yeah, that definitely seems to happen pretty frequently. Yeah. So then
yeah, like Sudetenland was brought up frantically when Putin announced the annexation of those four provinces, and they are Sudetenland was annexed in 1938, and Putin did at least purport to annex these territories last month. But how much you can extrapolate from the fact that those were both involved instances both involved annexations, probably requires a bit more argumentation to establish rather than just like asserting it. So yeah, and like there are other aspects to the analogization as well that kind of impelled me to dig a little bit more deeply into like the source of the analogies, because what I could ascertain after thinking about it for a while is that the basic reason why the World War II analogies are invoked is because World War II is understood to have been the military intervention undertaken by the U.S. that it has the most unambiguous like moral value, right?
sure.
The popular understanding is no one really questions it. It defeated the Nazis, defeated Imperial Japan, it defeated ended the Holocaust. That's kind of the conventional portrayal of it. And I think there's a whole lot more ambiguity around that in a variety of different directions that maybe people don't fully appreciate because they haven't really done a systematic review of the historical record. Maybe they don't appreciate it because they would prefer not to be exposed to some of the more maybe uncomfortable or awkward facts about U.S. intervention into World War II. But whatever the reason, clearly World War II still today, more than any time I can really recall, at least in my own kind of conscious adult life, it still has a huge potency in terms of like the moral content it's supposed to tell us in terms of how we are to think about contemporary issues. And I think one reason why it's so potent now is because we're being commanded to think about the current conflict in Ukraine, maybe even encompassing wider conflicts with Taiwan, but definitely Ukraine and Putin and so forth. We're being instructed to think about it like in the same moral dimension as the conflict known as World War II, in that it was the U.S. Defending democracy against the brutal encroachment and conquest of fascism / authoritarianism. And now that's been revived as like the guiding impetus of kind of the world organization, apparently. And so the urgency of combating Hitler and fascism in 1941 is of a similar order as the urgency of combating Putin and whatever I guess fascism is ascribed to him today. And I think that's not exactly a recipe for clear-headed thinking or rational analysis. Given how enlivened people just sort of innately seem to get around Hitler and fascism and the Holocaust and such. So I mean, my impression is that the importation of that sort of moral kind of formulation from World War II, really, I don't know if it's consciously intended to like sow irrational thought or like hyper emotionalism and then preclude reasoned debate, but that seems to be the functional effect of it. So I think it's worth sort of probing on from that angle.
Gotcha. So where my political understanding is at right now is outside of very select academic circles, because even in a lot of academic circles, it seems that when events or comparisons are made, or when words or labels are used, it almost seems exclusively like people are drawing on a bunch of like normative baggage or like moral or ethical baggage from these words, and then that's kind of how it's used. So when I see somebody say something like, when somebody says, for instance, like, you're a fascist, the way that I usually interpret that in my head is, this is a person I don't like. Like, because if you, like,
You're bad.
yeah, if you ask 95% of people, like, oh, well, what is fascist to you? One guy actually, one guy's exact answer, we fought about this over Twitter, then we came on to stream to argue about it, and his answer was, fascism is when, like, big bad guys use a lot of power to do stuff. And I was like, okay.
Yeah,
Sure.
well,
Yeah.
there's a short column that George Orwell wrote during World War II. Like, during, I think it might have even been the Battle of Britain, or World War II was well underway, and he basically concluded that every rival political faction was just calling each other a fascist at that point, with no regard for any kind of intelligible definition of what fascism actually was. So the communists would be calling the socialists fascists, and the conservatives would be calling the fascists, and vice versa, and everything in between. So yeah, I mean, it's funny because it really does have a very similar function today, because it's such like an amorphous concept. You could just appropriate it for whatever ends you want.
For sure. And then ironically enough, even back in the World War II days, with the Soviet propaganda, even liberals were considered fascists, right? With I think it was called social fascism, was the idea that they were trying to push out to the rest of the world. I think the KPD in Germany, I think, was embracing that idea that liberalism falls to fascism, and liberals are essentially fascists, which is what you see a lot of like very far left-leaning people today even say. They kind of repeat that rhetoric.
Fascism is not like communism, right? Karl Marx explicated the foundational tenets of at least Marxist.
Well, depends.
Well,
I would
fascism
either
is just
agree or
like a word
disagree.
that was imputed to like a tendency that kind of grew, not really by way of this sort of more like organized ideological construction.
Yeah, for sure.
So
like fascism was kind of like a retrospective. Like communism was like philosopher Marx, Engel, whatever these losers are, make a political, well, not even political theory, but a philosophical theory relating stuff, and then people build off of that. I think fascism, I don't think anybody set out to build a fascist regime, right? They didn't think like, oh, this is fascism, let's do it.
Regimes emerged, and then
we were
it was
called
determined that they should be classified as fascist.
Yeah. I will say though today,
actually, Italy though, I think that term was used in Italy, but that's kind of an exception.
Sure. Today, I think that fascism and socialism or communism are used all kind of in similar ways, where it's usually just used to say, I don't like the person, or maybe sometimes it's used to say, for the communist part, I do like the person. Because again, I feel like in contemporary conversation, communism and fascism are almost entirely divorced from whatever the fuck they were supposed to mean, which is one of the funny things, because then you'll get into these like infinite arguments over, some people defend Soviet Russia under Stalin, some people don't, and then just as many people will argue whether it was real communism or not real communism or whatever, and then that's like a whole other like like if somebody basically says, I'm a communist, they have communicated no information to me. I don't know what the fuck. Are you really for the abolishing of all of like the means and modes of production and that, or do you just want like more social spending like in Scandinavia, but that are capitalist countries? So yeah,
and that was always like a running sort of paradox of the Bernie Sanders campaigns in 2016 and 20, because although Bernie Sanders himself did self-identify as a Democratic
and took huge public hits for it. He was taking hits for it, but he wasn't even a socialist. Like, what are you doing, Bernie?
he never called for expropriating the means of production. So like, why? I mean, if that's not what you're demanding, you really need to take like the rhetorical hit of associating yourself with that word. I mean, I remember in the 2000s, before socialism became like, at least socialist as a moniker began to become a little bit more mainstream, as like with the Bernie Sanders campaigns as a vehicle, and like changes in the media landscape and such. Like back when it was still pretty more relegated, substantially more relegated to the fringe, whenever a Republican or like a Republican pundit, or like Bill O'Reilly on talk radio or something would mention the word socialist, all he really meant was someone who is not a Republican and who is bad.
Yeah, or somebody that wanted like some more government spending is essentially like you're a hardcore socialist.
Yeah, but not even that though, because like, I mean, Bill O'Reilly wanted more government spending, but just just on the military and police and whatever.
Well, that's always been the ultimate irony of Republicans, is they say that they're like for us. Well, they don't say austerity in the United States, but they'll say like smaller government, cutting budgets or whatever. But as soon as they get into office, it's spend, tax cut, deficit, spend. Like that's what they do. But
well, they used to say that. Trump didn't even pretend to endeavor to do that. He kind of just abolish
Kind
like,
of.
the
I would
Paul
say it
Ryan
was a
sort
little
of
implicit when he would
contract.
say like, "We need to run this country like a business." That kind of sounds like balanced budgets to me and stuff. But yeah, I mean, like
Well,
the
but
tactics were.
I mean, he explicitly pledged, not to cut Social Security and Medicare. I mean, he basically renounced the Paul Ryan style, shrinking of the social
Yeah.
welfare state.
I think he had
So,
to because that was always the Democrats' attack on Republicans because some of the
yeah.
ultra crazy Republicans were in those talks of like privatizing parts of Social Security and stuff, and that's like your voter base
Well,
are
Bush
all old
tried to.
people. Yeah.
Bush in 2005, right after he was reelected, that was his first attempted legislative initiative to privatize Social Security, and it went nowhere.
Yeah, well, Republicans are too old now for that. I think to try to be doing that with Social Security, you're going to lose a lot of voters. But yeah,
Yeah, the
okay.
population is that's actually a good point. The population just simply aged too much demographically for it to be tenable anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, maybe Bush could have done it, but now 15 years later, that's a lot of
Yeah.
people collecting Social Security that aren't going to be too
Yeah.
happy. And as much as Republicans will talk shit on government programs, Social Security works pretty well insofar as you get a paycheck every month. You don't have to think much about it. Okay, so Ukraine stuff.
Yeah.
I'm a globalist, pro U.S. involvement in Ukraine insofar as they are. Very anti-Russian.
What does it mean to be pro? What does it mean to be a globo homo?
I don't know. I like the concept of global U.S. hegemony to some extent.
Right.
I'm supportive of steps for the United States, for the European Union, for NATO to kind of have these big international bodies of countries that kind of like work together, set trade agreements and everything. The slur that people on the right use for people like me are globo homos, but I would say
Yeah, I've encountered that.
Gotcha. Yeah, go.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that I dislike American hegemony because number one, it would just be deeply hypocritical in that clearly I'm reaping the benefits of living in the most powerful country in world history. I have a high standard of living, comparatively speaking. Living in America has afforded me lots of opportunities that I'm sure I would never have had access to if I, by accident of birth, ended up someplace else. And on top of that, it's funny because one of the strains of like furious denunciation of me on the internet is that like, oh, I'm just like a knee-jerk anti-American. I hate America, and that like is fundamentally why I'm presenting these critiques or like skeptical inquiries on different aspects of U.S. policy, and it really couldn't be further than the truth. Funnily enough, I to the extent that I've had like debates with or I guess like political conflict with people on the left, people who are genuine leftists, it's usually over them really having some kind of like antipathy toward the U.S. or like an America or like the American project or American culture, something about like the ingrained nature of the United States they just viscerally don't like, right? I mean, there is a strain of the left that I think meets that sort of definition. And I never identified with that. I mean, I actually like the United States, again, partially for selfish reasons, because it's the most sort of interesting place to live, I think, as the number one military and economic hegemon. And number two, I actually just generally like the country itself in terms of like the people. I've been all over the U.S., pretty much every region. I've done a lot of largely through different journalism I've done, but also just for various purposes. And I do have like just a strong personal affinity for the country. So it's so incongruous with my own sort of conscious sense of my own beliefs when I'm told that I actually somehow loathe America, which is not true. However, that's not that affinity for America, and even like a basic acceptance. And this is another point of contention with people on the left. I've made the argument that there could be like a generic sort of simple homespun form of patriotism or even reverence for patriotic symbols like the flag or whatever that could be channeled into productive toward productive ends. So I did a column after the Bernie Sanders dropped out of the 2020 campaign saying it seemed like this particular campaign in 2020 did not adequately sort of reflect what made the 2016 campaign more successful than people thought, because there was sort of like this Americana ethos associated with Bernie Sanders at the time. Like they had that Simon and Garfunkel ad with the song America, where he's showing, the cornfields and, the Fourth of July parades and whatever. Like, it didn't really capture that same sort of, I don't know, ethos. And I said, okay, so, and that I made the point along those lines, and there was a meltdown. But anyway, like, but whatever affinity I have, for American culture, or people, and et cetera, or even my own station in life as provided by having been born in America, that doesn't bar me at all. Except, in fact, it actually probably obligates me to be ever more critical or skeptical, or at least attentive to the actual byproducts of American hegemony, namely, military hegemony, because that's the most like acute expression of American hegemony, I think,
and the most, and arguably the most influential for some countries over it. Yeah,
sure, yeah. So I mean, that's my attitude in terms of why I'm oriented, to what extent I'm oriented toward like scrutinization of American hegemony, not because I have like some sort of deep-seated loathing of the American project, which I don't. I actually think there's a lot to like about the American project that's unique in history. It's freedom of speech. I mean, the United States has far more uniform free speech protections enshrined in its founding document than pretty much anywhere else in the world ever has. And I think that's a like normatively good thing. And there are plenty of other normatively good things, but if that should actually be an extra incentive to, I think, be diligent about trying to dispassionately analyze the effects, good or ill, of U.S. policy, and given like again the high stakes that we're in now, where Joe Biden is saying that we're on the precipice of nuclear Armageddon. I don't know. I feel like that's probably a good reason to be even more attuned.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of one of the frustrating things I kind of run into on that kind of same train of thought is when you'll make an argument about how like, well, the United States, we could do better in this regard or this regard, say, police brutality or whatever, whatever you think the stats are. But a Republican response sometimes would be like, oh, well, if you don't like it, like, leave the country. Or, well, we're doing better than, this random fucking country in Africa or South America or Eastern Europe or whatever. And it's like, okay, well, hold on. We're the United States of America. I don't want to be doing better than them. I want to be doing better than like the entire OECD. Okay. Like we should be competing with Germany and the UK and Norway and Sweden, not competing to do better than, like the new countries that formed out of Yugoslavia or whatever sub-Saharan African countries you want to point to. Like, that's not the goal, right? We should be the best of the best, not like the best of whatever subset of things you want to pick from.
Yeah.
I do think in general, progressives lost or Democrats in general have a really hard time tapping into patriotism, when I think that there are a lot of things that if you're patriotic, you can be proud of if you're on the left, like America fights for, however you feel, like gender or racial stuff. And we fight for things in ways that other countries in Europe haven't even like gotten to yet, Yeah, that's definitely an underutilized thing. It's talking about patriotism from a left-leaning point of view, but
yeah, well, it's funny because when you say that it's sort of like this reflexive conservative riposte to tell someone who has a criticism of America, get out, or something like that. That's exactly what my impression would have been for much of like the formative years of my political development. I don't know how old you are, but like the Iraq War was
33,
the thing that. Okay, I'm 34. So like the Iraq War was the thing that it was the first thing that I can consciously recollect actually developing an autonomous opinion about in the political sphere, just because, obviously it was a huge issue. And it also coincided with like the phase of, I guess, adolescence where you begin to have the ability to like sort of reason more independently on issues that, are in the political or international domain and stuff. And, we had just this, I can't tell you why exactly, but I was just had this intuitive opposition to it. And, that sort of was the organizing principle of the formation of my political identity, such as it existed at that time. And so, yeah, whenever
like a lot of kids who grew up
Iraq...
in like the Vietnam era were kind of defined
exactly,
by
yeah,
opposition to, in the Vietnam era.
Right, right. So whenever a criticism of, Bush's Iraq policy was made, you would have this chorus of like angry right-wing, pundits or whatever saying, well, if you don't like America, get out, or, something to that effect. And so I always associated that reflex with the hardcore sort of right-wing militarists. But interestingly enough, 20 years later or so, a lot of that seems to have flipped, or at least I see that sort of reflex um, within a very, aggressive strain of liberalism or even left liberalism that is, more ascendant today. So, I mean, I know you can't really extrapolate all that much from like just online commentary, but
Well, you have to be very careful when you do, otherwise you can get lost
I
very
know,
quickly.
I
Yeah.
know. But I mean, I can report that I can't tell you how many times people who are, hardcore left liberal of some kind, and are seeing a criticism or seeing like a skeptical point I've raised about, U.S. policy, Biden administration, whatever, vis-a-vis Ukraine, whose like instinctive reaction is to say, okay, then get the hell out. I mean, why, if you hate America so much, why are you here? So it's pretty much the same. It's pretty much a mirror image of like in 2003 when they had the whole ridiculous freedom fries thing and everybody who didn't like the Iraq war should go live in France with Johnny Depp.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, it's it's the flip side of that, and it's sort of interesting because it suggests to me that actually whatever that impulse is, it's not like
It doesn't only find
on
itself in one
principle
political
tethered
party.
to the right. Yeah,
Exactly,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
Which is unfortunate. That's probably as I've gotten older, and I'm sure probably the same for you. There are things that you would have associated at one point in time with like people on the left, people on the right, and then you kind of get a little bit older and you're like, ah, fuck. Like it feels like there's a big bag of things, and people just kind of pick and choose with whatever works at the time, for whatever their political ideology is. Like I don't know if I'll live long enough to see this, but one of the craziest things to me, or one of the most interesting things I could imagine, is if the Hispanic vote did start to flip to the right. I'm really curious if you would see the immigration platforms dramatically shift on both sides. Like, would Democrats start talking a lot more like Bernie Sanders in terms of, okay, well, hold on, let's think about local jobs, let's be a little bit more protectionist. Do we really need more immigrants coming in? And would Republicans flip and go, well, hold on, some of these Hispanic people are really good, they're escaping bad countries, we need to, have them build our economy, bring them in. I wonder if the immigration stances would flip if the voting patterns flipped a lot. I wonder that sometimes.
Well, I mean, in the 2020 election, the reason why, one reason why it was like relatively closer than people might have thought, given how catastrophically the reelection of Trump was presented, and in that, if this happens, democracy's over, et cetera. The catastrophizing was, it was mutual. So if Joe Biden wins, it's like,
I was one of those catastrophizers, by the way. I think if Trump would have been elected, I think it would have been one of the worst things that could have happened in U.S. history.
Well,
but yeah,
I'm generally anti-catastrophizing, especially by partisan political operators, because my inference in observing catastrophization over the years is that most of the time it's done just out of pure partisan interest. Now, that doesn't mean partisans can't actually believe what they're saying to some degree, but there's a political imperative or partisan imperative to exaggerate the supposedly seismic differences between the two parties to like rally the base or to stigmatize the opposition, and I think a lot of the time it doesn't really hold the catastrophic outcomes that are prophesied.
It's always your political prerogative to say that
exactly.
like the opposition is representing a threat to the entire United States or the entire country. Of course, sure, I understand that. Yeah.
Because, people said in the, I'm sure you probably remember, in the 2016 election, Hillary versus Trump, right? What was the principal argument made against Trump? It was basically a version of this catastrophization. Trump was going to do World War III or start a nuclear war. By the way, that's kind of ironic now. Or just that, Trump was such an unprecedented danger that we could not even tolerate even entertaining having him in office. Now, of course, I never supported Trump. I never voted for Trump. But that doesn't necessarily prevent me from noticing that there was this huge sort of renaissance of utterly unhinged histrionics around Trump that actually didn't comport most of the time with what he was actually doing in office policy-wise, or with the reality of what his political ascendance actually.
I feel like
produced.
Trump is hard to analyze because I think two things happened simultaneously that makes it very difficult. Well, it either makes it very easy or very difficult, depending on if you're good or bad faith, navigating the conversations. On one hand, I think that the media was probably unhinged to an unprecedented amount when it came to covering Trump. But I also think that Trump was an unprecedentedly unhinged president. So I think I think there's a very weird world where it's like every single time like Trump poured fish food into the fucking water with Shinobi or whatever the fuck the Japanese prime minister was, there was like a front page story. I was like, okay, do I really care? Did he really pour all the fish food in? Do I really need to know this? But then on the other hand, you've got Trump making some of what are, in my opinion, some of the scariest statements I've heard from a president in my entire lifetime. So like statements regarding freedom of speech. When he was running, he would say things like people that burn the American flag deserve to be exported from the country or deported. I think he made that statement. Statements like the media is the enemy of the people, trying to do everything through executive action and military power, sending the military south to try to build the wall. These are statements that are very, very, very scary to me. And then the undermining of the election. Holy shit, that's probably one of the worst things you can do as a president. So I do agree the media had a pretty unhinged coverage of Trump. SNL doing new skits every single fucking night. People talking about crazy shit all the time. But Trump...
Christmas carols to Robert Mueller.
Yeah, but wait, what was that?
The Christmas carols sung on these variety shows to Robert Mueller and special counsel. Yeah.
But then on the other hand, you did have like an unprecedented amount of unhinged behavior, in my opinion, from Donald Trump in terms of like how he was conducting himself. So there's like just enough there that either side can grab what they need and have their own narratives. But then there's also enough there that if you're trying to go in and honestly figure out what's happened, there's plenty of criticisms to go around. But Trump is definitely like part of that group getting criticized, and for good reason, I would say.
Well, I mean, for sure, Trump himself reveled in his ability to make others unhinged, like to make his antagonists unhinged, and he, did the actions that he knew would provoke that response. The way I always thought about this was that on the level of like public presentation, so his communication style, the mere fact that he actually was personally tweeting a lot of the time, seemingly.
Absolutely, it was him,
just the fact that like he hadn't held elected office. I mean, he was the first president since he was the first nominee, I think, since Thomas Dewey in the 40s to be nominated for president of a major party without having held either political office or military some military leadership position. So really his approach to politics prior to 2016 have just been one of a pundit. Like he would go on to Fox and Friends, he would just muse about stuff, just kind of speculate and riff. And so it's not like he was, a lawyer who, trained to become a congressman his entire life and therefore was like incredibly scrupulous about only ever expressing support for policies that he would then be comfortable like voting on as legislation. He would just kind of throw everything at the wall and see what stuck, right? So in terms of his public, and then he carried that forth into the presidency. I mean, I would often call him the pundit in chief. That seemed like his main concept of what the job of president entailed, just to like offer his thoughts on stuff. And much of the time wasn't actually connected to any kind of policy mechanism. So the way I kind of distilled it was, on one level, on this level of public communications, his style of humor, his attacks, his feuding, whatever, that was unprecedented. But on another level, the Trump presidency wasn't unprecedented at all. In fact, it was extremely conventional for the most part. That was like more on the policy level. I mean, there's not really a whole lot that happened, I don't think. Maybe a couple of exceptions on the margins.
Policy-wise, Trump was an unmitigated failure, I would say, for the Republican Party. He didn't get...
Well, you could say he was a failure, but it wasn't like this unprecedented, radical, 4 years in terms of the actual policy that was imposed.
For sure.
But people were saying in 2016 that Trump was going to institute, impose, I don't know, some like Nazi-style concentration camp extermination system or something, something like so radically extreme we could barely even fathom it. Meanwhile, I mean, what did he do when he got into office and they had the unified Republican control of government? When Republicans controlled the House and the Senate. Well, I mean, they did what you'd expect them to do. They passed a corporate tax cut. Okay, that might be bad. You might consider that a failure. You might not support that, but it's not like this radical, unprecedented move.
Yeah, policy-wise, Trump, I would say Trump failed in enacting much of an agenda, other than like what a standard Republican agenda would have been. On paper, it looked like whatever. The issue, though, was I think that Trump's rhetoric, I would say, was uniquely damaging to the office of the presidency and to the brains of Republican voters. I can't think of anybody in my lifetime, and probably even before my lifetime, I'm sure if you go far back enough, I'm not going to be able to tell you anything about presidents in the 1800s or 1700s. But like, I can't think...
James K. Polk, he was out of his mind.
Yeah, like the undermining, so like the big one that I would focus on would be the undermining of the election. That's really scary to me. And I can't think of any political elected official, I don't think, like federally, that has rhetoric on par with Trump saying that the election was going to be rigged 9 months in advance or whatever. That's
Yeah.
unbelievable to me. And while I can't point to like, well, there's a policy that he did about that thing, the phone calls that he was making, the rhetoric from the Republican Party, the challenges to the election, the things that he tried to do, getting Pence to undermine stuff, asking for Barr to do these investigations, trying to throw up roadblocks to the FBI and the Mueller stuff and everything. Like all of the actions that he took in commission, some of that was related to Russia, not election stuff, but all of the actions he took, especially insofar as just drawing a little circle around the election stuff, I think that alone is probably one of the scariest things that I've seen. And I think that there are moments where the surprisingly, I would say, U.S. institutions and individual actors, a lot of them who were Republicans, actually stepped up and did their proper job to ensure the proper functioning of our democratic institutions. But if any of these had folded, like, holy shit, who knows? You know, what if Barr would have been more on Trump's side, which I would have expected him to be, and he would have come and said, you know what, these voting machines were rigged. But Barr didn't say that. He said the opposite. Or what if Pence would have said, you know what, I am going to push as hard as I can to get these votes not certified. But he didn't do that. He said we were going to count the votes properly. Yeah, that's scary to me. And I think that's uniquely scary. And I think there is room to call out Trump uniquely for that behavior.
Well, I mean, the behavior post the 2020 election, I think, yeah. I mean, it doesn't have any
that was
precedent
before,
that I'm aware of.
Yeah, that was before the election, right?
I mean,
You were saying
the
beforehand.
behavior the behavior in relation to contesting the outcome of the 2020 election, I don't think that has a precedent really in history. So that is sort of a thing that you can sort of bracket out as like a genuinely unique thing to scrutinize. But I think overall, the utter sort of monomaniacal fixation on Trump's rhetoric as the single most important thing about him, and the thing that everybody either had to be perpetually terrified by or perpetually like euphoric about, whether, you know, pro con, you know, that dynamic itself was extremely distorting. You know, you say that had this effect on Republican voters. Yeah, it did, of course. I mean, any president, especially one who has this outside presence of Trump, as Trump did, is going to have a sort of indelible impact on just like the voting coalition he presides over. But I mean, it also had just as strong, or maybe even a stronger impact, meaning his rhetoric, on Democrats, on liberals. I mean, resistance, right? I mean, the energization and the mobilization and like the emotional investment of liberals in particular under Trump, I think was probably without precedent in U.S. history, at least in terms of energy directed at a president. It was hugely intense, and you know, and that had electoral consequences. I mean, 2018, I want to say it had the highest turnout for any midterm election since 1914. Something like that. So, you know, they were able to marshal that energy and, you know, get Democrats the majority in the House. So, you know, it was clearly had some effect along those lines. But it had also distortive effects that I think continued to dog us. So, I mean, we could even bring it back to Ukraine, right? So I don't think, I mean, you tell me if I'm wrong here. You think your average Democrat is aware that the Trump administration's policy, like what policies were actually implemented by the Trump administration with respect to Ukraine, were substantially, you know, by several significant degrees, more what you might call anti-Russia, in the sense that they were pro-Ukraine and, you know, fortifying Ukraine militarily. Trump started the provision of lethal weaponry to Ukraine. Trump elevated Ukraine into this precursor status within NATO for potential ultimate admittance as a full member. Trump and Pompeo sort of constructed this bilateral diplomatic arrangement between the U.S. and Ukraine, where, you know, bilateral military ties were enhanced, bilateral other kinds of ties were enhanced, and that's the very thing that Putin says anyway that he loathes the most, right? The conversion of Ukraine into this basically outpost of the United States / NATO. That was accelerated very drastically under Trump, whereas Obama's approach was pretty much the opposite. You know, not the opposite, but not as aggressive or anywhere close to as aggressive as Trump's was on that score. I mean, I was just reading today some coverage of the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and Obama's response, and you know, Obama was being denounced by Ted Cruz for appeasing Putin because he wasn't going far enough in, you know, deploying, you know, missiles to Poland and doing all kinds of military responses that Ted Cruz and like the foreign policy hawks, like John McCain,
Yeah,
wanted
so
Obama to do. Yeah.
something
I mean,
that
do you think? So do you think that most like your average Democrat would be aware that that was the actual policy impact of the Trump administration, or would they be aware of like the rhetorical flourishes that Trump sometimes blurted out, where people at the Helsinki summit in 2018 said, "Oh, maybe Putin didn't hack the election, and therefore Trump had committed treason," or stuff like that. I mean, I think that probably informs their conception of what Trump actually did in office more than the policy itself, and that seems like a distorting dynamic to me.
True, but I mean, like, that's the history of all of American politics on every side. No, like, if you ask somebody name 3 pieces of like successful legislation by Barack Obama, like, most people don't even know the name of Obamacare, right? Like, you could get different pollings asking.
I think a lot of people know Obamacare.
No, but they won't know that it's called the Affordable Care Act, right? They won't even be able to name that. Yeah. They'll just be like, oh, Obamacare was good. And if you ask them one more step, well, what did Obamacare do? Most people would actually have no idea. What are a couple provisions of what Obamacare did? Maybe they would say, like, nobody can be denied health insurance. But like in terms of like actual engagement with policy, Americans in general are really bad, of course. That's one of my like that's one of my like easy wins against anybody that comes on arguing like, I think Trump is really good. And I'll say, okay, well, name 3 good Trump policies, or like 2 pieces of legislation. They're like, well, Trump wanted to build the wall, and it's like, okay, well, that doesn't really tell us much. So yeah, I agree. I'm just talking average American voter, right? I agree with you there. Like, American voters aren't very policy focused; they're very rhetoric focused. They really are. One thing that I would be hesitant, and I don't know if you were walking here, if you were just giving this an example, is when we say things like, well, Trump actually was, in favor of like selling arms to Ukraine and doing all of this. And it's like, okay, yeah, sure. But some people might walk that a couple steps further and go, well, we know that if Trump would have been the leader when Russia tried to push into Ukraine and then continue to escalate this stuff, like they did when they invaded after for the recent invasion, whatever, in 2021, 2022, sorry. My years are fucked.
Wait,
COVID.
The current war?
The current war. Yes, the current invasion.
February 22,
not the one in 2014. Not the one. Yeah. That if Trump would have been the leader now, Trump would have been pushing back just as hard as Biden would have been because he sold arms to Ukraine. I don't know if that logically follows, because while you can argue that Trump was doing things to like increase arms and whatever to Ukraine, like, I don't know if politically, Ukraine wasn't a very hot button issue for Americans. Most Americans didn't even know or care much about like stuff happening with Crimea. I think I heard about that in the American news cycles for like 1 or 2 days. And even Georgia was like, that was like another like 1 or 2 day thing. I heard like tanks are rolling into Georgia. Half of America was like, how did they get tanks all the way to Georgia?
John McCain was the Republican nominee at that point, and he declared we are all Georgians now.
Yeah, but like this was like a news cycle for like 2 or 3 days, and then it was like gone.
Yeah.
Mainly because I think because of exhaustion from Iraq, we didn't care at all about foreign policy at that point. We were like, fuck that, we want to focus on our own shit. Especially post.
I think you're. But
right just, real quick on the ending of that though. I was going to say the thing that people would look at though to try to be more instructive on how they think Trump might respond to Russia pushing into Ukraine was Trump seemed to have this overall kind of very isolationist view of America with the rest of the world, and I think that was exemplified in his huge attacks, both rhetorically and financially, against NATO. And I think Trump's constant and consistent undermining of NATO is something that people would point to, and they would look at that and they go, if Ukraine had this conflict today with Russia and Trump was a president, I'm not sure where Trump would stand on that. Is his rhetoric around NATO more relevant than whether or not they sold weapons to Ukraine or not? I'm not entirely sure,
Yeah, well, a couple things on that. First, on the point about whether Americans have always been more interested in rhetoric than policy, yeah, I mean, I guess you could make a case that that's generally been true, but I do think there was something distinct about how much like radically more interested they were in rhetoric versus policy under Trump in particular.
Sure.
I think if you ask people like, okay, what did George W. Bush do in office? They might come up with the Iraq War. They might come up with like a couple of things he actually did. Obama, they might say, they might not say Affordable Care Act, but they might know of Obamacare, right? With Trump, I think a lot of people, especially Democrats, they would just give you vagaries about how he endangered democracy with his tweets or something, right? It wouldn't be a policy-based response, most likely. Anyway, that's speculation. I mean, my strong sense, though, is that whatever gulf had existed between interest in policy and interest in rhetoric vastly widened under Trump to, or maybe even an unprecedented extent. Yeah, and I agree with you that people don't really have a very good basis for making an argument that Trump would have just done the exact same thing as Biden on Ukraine had he been in office. Number one, it's a counterfactual. You can't prove or disprove it. More and more.
And when it comes to foreign policy, things are so complicated. Like one thing could have
Yeah,
changed a million other things, right? Yeah.
I'm more and more weary of sort of entertaining these counterfactuals to begin with, because like you can't prove anything. So like, how do you resolve the argument, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, my approach would just be to simply examine what did happen under the Trump administration.
Yeah.
That's what we do have available to assess.
And ignoring even historical counterfactuals, just like historical factuals are still not understood. Why isn't Russia doing as well in Ukraine as people thought? Like that's if that would have been a counterfactual, if we would have argued in the future, well, what if Russia would have invaded Ukraine? That counterfactual would have said they would have conquered Ukraine in 2 weeks. But now we can see what's actually happened, and even that hasn't actually happened. So yeah, get historical counterfactuals, especially on huge macro events, are always like they're fun to kind of like think about, but when people get real serious in arguments about it, like you have no fucking idea how these massive foreign affair macro events would have played out, and to pretend otherwise is really silly.
Yeah, and there's such like impossibly multifaceted, multi-causal events. The idea that you can like predict anything, you can't even predict what's going to happen in like the actual world and the factual world. So this idea that you can like time travel and like change one little variable in the whole equation, and then like, you know which trajectory it's going to go down. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm actually I'm considering fashioning like a historiographical case for like why counterfactuals just need to be discarded. That's another discussion.
There's like it's like people that say like if you would have just if this country would have moved these troops in this war, they would have won the entire war and the whole history of the Clinton administration. I was like maybe they would have moved there, a supply line would have gotten cut off, and they would have all starved to death. Like who the fuck knows? Like there's a lot of stuff that seems like it would have happened, and it the Twin Towers was the first time in history that should ever happen. If you believe in 9/11, I know yet, right? The Titanic was the biggest, most unsinkable ship in the world, and it sunk on its first voyage. There's a lot of crazy shit that happens sometimes, and to try to predict everything is pretty wacky. Yeah.
Well, I mean, think of telling somebody in 1995, right, that within 20 years or so, you'll have a black guy elected president and then Donald Trump elected president. I think that would have been seen as somewhat implausible.
A little wacky,
But yeah, in terms of but the reason why I sort of try to insist on actually scrutinizing the Trump administration's policy record rather than like whatever he mumbled on a given day on Twitter or something, is because I don't think most people are aware. I mean, a lot of Trump's supporters I've noticed don't like acknowledging this, and a lot of Trump's opponents don't like acknowledging this for their own reason, because it doesn't like accord with their sort of presumptions about what Trump did in office. But Lindsey Graham and John McCain, mainly Lindsey Graham, who then became like one of Trump's closest confidants. Even though they had been, hellish enemies, at least ostensibly at one point in the 2016 Republican primaries. But Lindsey Graham lobbied Trump in 2017 to, break from the Obama policy of not sending lethal weaponry to Ukraine, and to start doing so. And that lobbying initiative on the part of Lindsey Graham succeeded. Now, a lot of MAGA types will say, Lindsey Graham, nobody actually supports him. He's, not a real Republican. He's this, horrible interloper or something. He doesn't represent like our version of like what the Republican Party is. Meanwhile, Lindsey Graham was endorsed by Trump in the 2020 re-election campaign in South Carolina, and raised the most money of any Republican Senate candidate ever in 2020. So, I mean, the idea that Lindsey Graham doesn't have a constituency or something is just that you want to call it a cope on the part of these online conservative types who feel like they need to distance themselves from Lindsey Graham.
Sure.
But anyways, I mean, their lobbying initiative on Trump succeeded, right? And that pretty significantly altered the trajectory of U.S. policy in Ukraine in a direction that's arguably sort of at least helped to precipitate the situation that we're in now. And people forget, because it wasn't really well reported on or covered at the time. There's only been one impeachment in U.S. history that was centered on one of four impeachments in U.S. history. Of course, half of them were under Trump, but one of them, and the only one that was ever centered on anything to do with foreign policy, and was in 2019 with Ukraine. Right, Ukraine was the central issue in terms of the foreign policy dimension of that impeachment saga, and more or less what Trump was accused of doing was betraying America. I mean, this was actually in the impeachment report that the Democratic majority in the House produced. That more or less Trump betrayed America by temporarily freezing, but not actually ever delaying any shipments of weapons to Ukraine, because this was seen to be evidence that Trump was actually aiding the enemy of the United States, Russia, by, supposedly,
Well,
but
I
not
thought
really,
the issue
curtailing these
there,
weapons shipments.
I don't think the issue there
So,
was
yeah.
as much the aiding of Russia. It was more the impropriety of abusing the office as president to try to collect, like, compromising information on a political opponent from a relatively adversarial country. I think that was more than just being pro or anti-Russia, no?
Well, yeah, I mean, several things. I mean, yeah, they did talk about it in terms of just presidential malfeasance or corruption or whatever. But an overlaying theme, and the reason why it gained a lot of the momentum it did, was because, remember, this was a couple months after the Mueller report came out, and it didn't have the impact that a lot of Democrats would have liked, because they had assumed that they were going to be able to impeach Trump on the basis of the Mueller report. Didn't pan out, and then voila, here comes this transcript of a phone call between Trump and Zelensky, where he's like musing about, hey, can you check out what's going on with Biden, Hunter Biden or whatever in Ukraine. And then the reason why they moved forward on that impeachment, and this is what the Democrats in the House, in the Congress, Gerald Nadler, Pelosi, et cetera, this is what they said, is because they viewed it as a continuation of the Russian interference / Mueller narrative, but one that was actually more actionable and could actually be form the basis of an impeachment. So if you read the articles of impeachment that eventually came from that in December of 2019, they do make references to like the foreign policy dimension specifically, in that Trump kind of gave aid and comfort to the enemy of the United States, that being Russia, by temporarily withholding for corrupt reasons these weapons shipments. People also don't know, or never, they either forgot, never learned in the first place. I mean, you wouldn't know this pretty much anywhere other than actually watching the testimony of that impeachment proceeding, which I guess few people did, but the Democrats' own witnesses verified that no weapons shipments to Ukraine were ever actually delayed.
Sure. Well, that might be true.
Regardless,
well, I was going to say real quick. Well, that might be true.
Yeah.
That's totally besides the point, right? Like, just like, for instance, like in the United States court system, I can be charged with obstruction for justice even if I fail to do so, right? Like, or I can be charged with like attempted murder even if I don't kill somebody, or I can be like, there are things where I think that Trump tried at multiple points to either obstruct justice in terms of his conversations with like Comey or other people, or where you could argue there was like an attempt. No, we won't go January 6th. But I think that his attempt alone to do things might be bad, even if the actual action itself hadn't had occurred. Like if a president of the United States is making a phone call and saying like, hey, I want you to look into some stuff, or, you might not get that aid. Even if they do eventually get the aid, I don't think that initial like ask in the beginning is hugely improper, a huge abuse of power for the office of the presidency, I would say.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I wasn't even mentioning that to like say that, Trump was wrongly impeached or anything. I was just mentioning it to,
people tend to hyperbolize and exaggerate.
Or really to recall the bizarre centrality of Ukraine for whatever reason in U.S. politics in the very recent past. And then, and why I was going to get to the point as to why it could be the case or could not be that like Trump may have behaved differently. I actually think, regarding the war, I actually think there's a good case that Biden, like the actual views of Biden are highly significant in terms of how policy has been conducted right now. It's not just like this generic thing that any official would have done. Biden, because of the impeachment saga, because of this idea that Trump was, in hoc to Russia, Biden in 2020 pledged that, one of the things he was going to prioritize in office was confronting Russia. I mean, you can look at the campaign statements from, that year. And Biden had it as one of his, ideological missions once in office to, become far more aggressive against Putin in a way that he regarded Trump as having, abdicated his duty to do. And so, one, of course, this is a counterfactual, but it's sort of interesting to speculate on and just to highlight maybe some, relevant issues, I guess, is, in December of 2021, right? So, 2 months or so before the war started, Russia sent to the United States, not to Brussels or not to Kiev or not to, anywhere else, to the United States, basically a list of demands, or like an ultimatum style letter, written request for, X, Y, and Z assurances around, Ukraine's NATO status and that kind of thing. And more or less, the United States, at the direction of Biden and Blinken, the Secretary of State, refused to even, consider any kind of real negotiation on the core demands principally, Russia wanted Ukraine to adopt neutral status militarily, so like not concretely affirm that it would not join NATO, that it would not become like a military bulwark of the United States, that kind of thing. And because Biden and Blinken, and they said this at the time, because they were so wedded ideologically to this concept of maintaining the so-called open door policy of NATO, they didn't even, wouldn't even entertain any kind of negotiations on that particular subject. That's what Russia at least said was the most important of the demands, at least as related to the U.S. policy. And so, I do wonder if Trump had been in office, might he have been kind of less ideologically attached to this notion of like the NATO open door policy? I mean, who cares about the NATO open door policy?
Real quick, just real quick, just on terms of those demands, what my understanding was that the Russian demands were quite a bit like were pretty significant. And maybe even unreasonable.
They were, yeah.
Like, I think that weren't these people like requesting that like NATO forces were going back to boundaries that had been set like in the 90s, and they were looking for like a whole bunch of other restrictions on like how NATO could function. These are things that like the only reason why I'm careful of this, I have to be careful because sometimes I don't know every treaty that's brought up, but like there are a lot of things that like Russia says that are just like it's posturing. It would kind of be like me, like if I have an abusive partner and I go to my ex and I'm like, you're not allowed to talk to any of your family or friends ever, or else I'm going to beat you. And they're like, okay, well fuck it, and then you beat her, and then you're like, okay, well I told her, I gave her a deal and she didn't accept it, and so I was like, okay, but that was kind of a bullshit deal. I think Russia engages in that kind of behavior quite a bit. So and then I would also say like, what right does Russia have to determine the security arrangements or the alliances or even the trade deals that their neighbors engage in? It seems a little bit fucky to me as well, that like people are very quick to kind of throw, like when we talk about the Ukrainian conflict, Ukraine is like no one talks about. It's always like the United States and NATO, and then it's Russia, and like Ukraine has no seat at the table to their own war. Basically, it feels like sometimes, and I feel like people are really quick to hand wave like, well, what does Russia want for Ukraine? Well, what does the United States and NATO want for Ukraine? It's like, okay, well, what does Ukraine want for Ukraine? And if Ukraine is voting to join NATO or voting to look west to the European Union instead of this like Eurasian alliance that Russia is trying to craft, I feel like Ukraine should have a right, have some say in their own, a future. I would say their destiny to say, yeah.
Well, I mean, NATO is not like a cafe that anybody can walk into off the street, right? It's a military alliance that's primarily led and organized and commanded, actually, logistically, by the United States. So the United States gets a veto over who can join.
We do, but I think our policy's generally been as long as countries want to join, right?
Well, I mean, I was just going to say that, the point of diplomacy, right? So an argument for why it would be good to conduct actual thoroughgoing diplomacy at that moment, December 2021, was not that you would thereby be validating like the rightness of Russia making any of their demands or saying that they were justified in issuing any of the demands, right? It's not like a normative, you're not like ascribing any kind of normative value to Russia's demands in that context, right? You're having a diplomatic exchange in order to hopefully resolve whatever issues are present without needing to resort to the use of force or with to hopefully curtail armed conflict, right? That's the objective of diplomacy.
Sure, and, but I mean, like, there's also
but it was the stated policy. I mean, it was the stated policy determination of the Biden administration on what apparently was the most central demand of Russia's, that it was in the United States' power to address the issue of military neutrality of Ukraine. That wasn't even on the table to be discussed in any significant sense. Now, I mean, looking back, I mean, would it have been? Do you think it might have been? Not you personally, but like, don't you think it might have been preferable to, I don't know, at least entertain the concept of making some kind of concession on the question of military neutrality of Ukraine, if it would have meant, averting the war? I mean, the war is a very bad outcome, right? So maybe people like the concept of the open door policy of NATO, but like if there's a trade-off, and the trade-off that you could make is that you don't get the war and you don't get like this, Cuban Missile Crisis scenario ran, and $70 billion of limitless quote unquote aid being sent, et cetera, and like we don't know where the escalatory spiral is going next. It seems that in hindsight, and I could have told you this at the time, and I did say it, this weird sort of zealous attachment to like the everlasting primacy of NATO's open door policy seems like a bit strange in terms of priorities.
Why does it seem strange?
Well, I mean, because I mean, if your priorities, to me, the most rational priority in this situation would have been to prevent the war from breaking out, right? And in
Well, so
theory,
let's look at
if a concession along those lines, or at least like entertaining diplomacy in a meaningful way on that particular issue, could have forestalled the war or preempted or averted it entirely.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there, but like
that's ought to have been done, and they just like on an ideological level refused to do it. And I think a lot of that was informed by this like radicalization or this intensification of the Democratic Party, like national security establishment, even Joe Biden himself over the course of the Trump years, where Trump was Putin's puppet, got to impeach him over Ukraine, Robert Mueller, all this kind of hardened attitudes toward what kind of negotiations could be tenable with Russia. And I think that seems to not have produced a very great outcome.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It might have produced the best outcome. Right? That's hard to say. Right now we're saying that, well, yeah, it's possible. Because right now we're saying it's easy to say that war could have been avoided potentially. But what does avoiding war look like? In my opinion, and in the opinion probably of most people in Ukraine, the 2014 seizure of Crimea was wholly unacceptable. That was, you can't just take territory from a country like that. So once we've gone past 2014, we're already in a pretty fresh area of, at least from the 90s, from 91 onwards, where a country is stealing land from another country in Europe. But it's a pretty crazy thing that's going on. So from 2014 and onwards, like, what do our negotiations look like? Do we say, okay, well, you conquered that fair and square, you get to keep Crimea. Ukraine doesn't get any kind of like seat at the table for NATO, even though they should be a free country that has the right to determine their own security status. And then when you look at Russia and you look at how they've treated other neighbors, namely Georgia, where they've played out this exact same scenario, where South Ossetia and Abkhazia were independent territories that were peeled off, and then Russian freedom peace troopers came in and they arguably genocided some Georgians and moved some people out, and then they did the same thing there. When Ukraine looks at like countries and situations like that, and then when they have the right to choose what they want to do, like, what right do we have to say in the Western world to tell Ukraine, well, listen, we don't really care what you guys want to do at all. We don't even care what Russia does to you. You guys just have to kind of sit there and chill, and hopefully a war doesn't break out. Hopefully nothing happens, even though Russia's already stolen some territory from you. Like, I don't know what the negotiation looks like. I'm curious. Like, what can you imagine, like, the negotiation looks like with Russia? Like, what do we even say there?
Well, number one, it's the job of professional diplomats, namely like the chief diplomat in the United States, the guy who runs the State Department, Anthony Blinken, to come up with diplomatic avenues of diplomatic engagement, even in really difficult, seemingly intractable situations. I mean, diplomacy is a thing you do not because there are easy, obvious solutions for every global problem, but because like you have to actually work to resolve them. So I don't know. I just think in the range of possible outcomes, if I could, go back to, maybe a year ago today or something, and if you had given me like 100 different outcomes of things that could happen within the subsequent year, the largest ground war breaking out in Europe since 1945, and like a nuclear crisis that's as comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis, according to Joe Biden anyway, and this just kind of brinksmanship going in every direction, and recession seemingly in Europe, in part because of the energy crisis and inflation, everything. It would have been like, I don't know, maybe in the top 10% of bad outcomes that could be possible. So yeah, I mean, would have a hard time thinking that this is like one of the better outcomes, but maybe like my range of potential outcomes is too limited. So,
well,
which is all just to say that clearly there. I mean, I don't know for sure, right? We don't have a full record of everything that went on.
Yeah, just to guide your answer. Just to guide your answer, because you said that when you said this is one of the worst outcomes. In my opinion, any scenario that has Russia holding on to Crimea is a worse outcome than the war that's happening right now. That's how I would view this right now.
Really?
Yes.
So, okay, let's say
how can you let a country just invade a country and steal their shit? That's crazy. That's fucked up, right?
But I mean, I guess I'm not sure how like just retaining the imperfect or undesirable or whatever status quo in Crimea would have been worse than like a cataclysmic war where tons of people die and maybe even get incinerated in like a nuclear exchange.
I think that we have to. I think that the territorial sovereignty of countries, especially in Europe and Eurasia, really the rest of the world, but especially in Europe, can't be threatened. I think that accepting a security arrangement moving forward from 2021, 2022 onwards, where countries can invade other countries and take territory, and as long as they have nuclear weapons, it's okay. I think that's really bad for two reasons. I think, one, it's rewriting where we're at in the world in terms of security. This is just, we just haven't in decades, don't have countries go in and take territory. That's a hugely new rewriting of the rules of how the world's supposed to work, number one. And then number two, especially you talk about diplomatic solutions, there was an agreement on the table in 94 with the Budapest memorandums where Ukraine basically said, listen, we're going to give up our nuclear weapons so that you guys don't invade us. Please leave us alone. And that was violated. They gave up their nuclear weapons, and now Russia has invaded and stole their stuff. So what does that say to the rest of the world? It says either one, you need to join NATO immediately, and now we become like an insanely like multipolar world where everybody's like either with the Soviet Union, or, well, Russia, or with the United States with NATO, or two, you have to get nuclear weapons. Because if you don't have nuclear weapons, people are going to invade and steal your shit. And that's probably like a worst case scenario, right? So I would argue there is a future, and I'm doing the historical counterfactual thing that we both say we hate, but like there's a future where, let's say, I know, we're only talking hypotheticals, but like, say Russia, say we do solve things diplomatically. Okay, hold on, Russia, you can keep Crimea. I don't know about in the Donbass, whatever, but like you keep Crimea and then we kind of reset everything now. Every country that is a non-aligned country is like, okay, well, it's cool you guys do that. I need nukes immediately because fuck me, if I don't have nukes, somebody can steal my shit. And as long as they have nukes, I don't have a right to defend myself. And the whole world is going to succumb to their nuclear power. I think that's a really bad rule to set, which is why I would argue that, to back to my thesis, any outcome that involves Russia maintaining control of Crimea just because they could be nuclear bullies is a really, really, really bad outcome.
Okay, I still think it seems pretty obvious to me that like nuclear war versus Russia retains Crimea, nuclear war probably worse. But yeah, I mean, first of all, on the Budapest memorandum, people bring this up all the time. I mean, not that it's a particularly significant point, but it's worth noting that
you never got Belarus.
The new well, no, I was going to say like that version of the Ukrainian nation state was brand new at that point. Soviet Union had just dissolved. The Ukraine government, such as it existed at that point, did not have like operational control over the nuclear arsenal. That's was sort of why there was this multilateral arrangement to transfer them out, right? I mean, they were Soviet controlled.
But they did give them up. They had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and they shipped them all. They were like, yeah, fuck it, you guys, you could take it. But
they shipped out a nuclear arsenal that they did not, in practice, have any operational control over. So yeah, I mean that's true. I think I guess people just sort of invoke that for kind of like spurious grounds at times. It doesn't matter though. On this idea of territorial integrity, again, I find it odd that people. I'm not directing this at you personally, but often, no, because I don't. Yeah, okay, I'll direct it. I find it a bit odd that someone could at least claim to place such primacy on this adherence to like a extremely, basically an abstraction, right? Territorial integrity that really is never adhered to in any universal sense. Like, so people claim to favor somehow on principle territorial integrity. I mean, you could like read the Riot Act of flagrant violations of so-called territorial integrity that for some reason don't ever impact on the people who claim that they're the huge supporters of territorial integrity, and that's therefore why they're so passionate.
Oh wait, what's like an example of that? What you think
with Ukraine?
Like, what you think the West is right?
Well, I mean, right now, as we speak, there is a U.S. military occupation force in parts of Syria. I mean, It's not a huge. It's nothing like Ukraine in terms of the magnitude.
But to make that now, imagine if in Afghanistan, or imagine in Iraq, or imagine in Syria, if the United States was there and we said, okay, here we are in northern Syria. We've got all of our happy oil trucks driving north to Turkey, driving east to Iraq. We own this territory. We're actually going to take this territory from Syria. It's either going to become a breakaway state or it's going to become a territory of the United States of America. Now we can say in one breath, okay, well, the United States is occupying places of the world, but to break it away and to remove that sovereignty from Syria and to claim it as our own territory, that would be unprecedented. And rightfully so, people would be like, USA, what the fuck are you doing? We didn't do that even in Afghanistan. Afghanistan. We didn't do that in Iraq. We didn't do that in any, like, that would be just unbelievable. It would be a huge escalation in terms of threats to territorial sovereignty, even if we do have like a military presence somewhere, I would say.
Well, I mean, I've heard people try to make that distinction before. I think it's most not entirely, but at least partially a distinction without a difference. You know, the U.S. does claim authority and like literal legal jurisdiction over the areas in Syria that it currently occupies. I mean, military U.S. military law prevails on those territories.
It's a big difference. Though. It'd be a big difference if we said we're carving out this part of Syria to be like.
Yeah, it would be a difference. Not a difference,
not a distinction. A huge difference. The whole world would look at us like, USA, what are you fucking doing, right? Because now we've got like Article 5 triggers in the fucking country of Syria if you fuck with the territory, which is kind of what Russia's going for with Crimea and in Luhansk and Donetsk, where they're trying to say like, okay, that's our territory. If you attack us, we can nuke you because that's our actual country they're going to war with now, right? That's kind of what they're trying to do. And I think people would rightfully look at the United States and go, you guys are crazy. You need to stop that, USA. You can't actually take the land. You can have some military jurisdiction, fine, right? We do that in Guantanamo Bay, down in Cuba even. But like, it's different than like, this is our territory. I know it was yours, but now this is our fucking country, right? I think that's yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a difference. I'm not denying it would be a difference. I mean, on the Article 5 thing, it's interesting. I'm sure people would make arguments that Article 5 could be triggered whether or not the territory is formally annexed. So, like, if there was some big attack on, like, U.S. forces in Syria right now, I mean, could you trigger Article 5 for action? I don't know. I mean, Article 5 doesn't have this really specific...
I think I could be wrong, but I thought an Article 5 trigger specifically said it cannot be with troops deployed on foreign soil. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think Article 5 specifically says it has to be within your borders. Poland can't send fighters to China, have them shot down, and then trigger Article 5 to bring in NATO to fuck up China.
You know, I'm not 100% sure. You know, I was at the NATO summit actually this year in Madrid, so I tried to familiarize myself as much as possible with like the NATO bylaws. But what you basically figure out eventually is that, you know, NATO is whatever the U.S. decrees NATO is going to be. I mean, it's the primary military power. So yeah, on paper you have some of these, you know, rules and procedures and stuff, but those aren't like binding, or it's not like the Constitution, right? I mean, they can be changed and.
I mean, they could be, but it's not like we've got. I mean, like we've stuck pretty hard to like the NATO shit. I don't think that like. I don't think that there's like times where like the U.S. is doing stuff where like every country is like, fuck you, United States, you're a piece of shit or whatever. Like they're like, I think NATO works as a pretty slick, unified alliance. Like we move, like even earlier you mentioned the idea like, well, the U.S. has veto power and countries joining. Every country has veto power. In order for a country to join NATO, every country has to be okay with it. I think NATO works pretty well as a military alliance. I mean, like, there's a reason why NATO countries don't get, invaded. There's a reason why Ukraine looks and sees what happens to Georgia, looks up the Baltics to see how secure those guys are sitting, and they're like, I kind of want to be in fucking NATO too, you know? I think NATO works, like, pretty slick.
Well, I mean, there were a lot of people who were pretty unhappy about, you know, the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, NATO bombing of Libya in 2011, which, you know, had nothing to do with any kind of Article 5 trigger. You know, suddenly bombing Libya was in the purview of NATO in 2011, you know, the NATO military mission in Afghanistan, you know. Yeah,
people might have been unhappy with the outcome, but like the support going in was there, right? Gaddafi was insane. Like there were actual, like, well, I don't know how you feel in terms of like biological warfare.
What if the support was there?
I mean, like the support was there for the bombings in Libya, but the occupation afterwards was fucked.
Support among whom?
The support from NATO countries for for NATO operations in Libya.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was there was sufficient support among the governments of the United States, France, and the UK to launch the bombing.
And then same thing with like Yugoslavia and like the Serbians and genocide. Like I think that
I don't think people think it was a particularly great outcome to, you know, do regime change in Libya and
sure, the outcome was fucked.
We all agree with that. A migrant crisis and you know mass sort of instability and Gaddafi getting like rectally raped in the streets. I mean, that wasn't like the most heartwarming thing.
For sure.
I guess the point I was going to make though was that this idea that like territorial integrity is somehow this like overriding principle that we all aspire to, and that like dictates what outcomes we think are good versus bad. I mean, I think a lot of that is a pretense. I don't know if it's a pretense with you. I mean, I didn't want to like direct it at you personally because I don't know enough about you to do so.
That's fine. I can tell you about
I'm actually not going to do so because I don't know enough about you to like know if this is accurate. But I know a lot of the time it's like a conceit, because I mean, whether or not the U.S. presence in Syria, would be different if the U.S. formally annexed the territory. But either way, it's still not in keeping with this supposed notion of territorial integrity that everybody is singing kumbaya to. I mean, they're not respecting the quote unquote territorial integrity of the presiding Syrian authorities. And maybe you could say that's good or bad, but it's just simply not in accordance with the so-called territorial integrity mantra. In the case of China and Taiwan, the United States has, policy on the books that originates with Richard Nixon when he first did the opening with China, whereby the U.S. affirmed that Taiwan was solely and irrevocably within the jurisdiction of mainland China. So presumably, according to that, the territorial integrity issue as pertains to Taiwan would require affirming that China, mainland China, PRC, has political and military and economic control over Taiwan. But of course, that's not the way it works in practice. So people don't affirm territorial integrity in that respect in terms of that conflict. I mean, I know Iraq is sort of an easy analog to bring up, but like, what's the relationship of territorial integrity there? The U.S. endorsed the unilateral declaration of independence by Kosovo in 2008. That did not respect the quote territorial integrity of the country that it broke away from. Russia strenuously objected to that at the time, and they still complain about it today at the UN as like showing the hypocrisy of the U.S. Supposed ideological commitment to territorial integrity. And I've even talked to foreign U.S. People who work at the government at pretty high levels, who I'm not going to name because it was off record and stuff, but you'll even get them to admit, and they could be hardcore Russia hawks, you'll get them to admit that the Kosovo thing was just manifestly and obviously not an example of territorial integrity being maintained. It was the opposite.
Yeah,
it's always circumstantial. Sure. So this idea that suddenly with Ukraine, territorial integrity is the thing that we're all supposed to be so hyper animated by doesn't pass muster with me. I think people invoke territorial integrity with respect to Ukraine not because of their belief in territorial integrity as such, but because it's sort of a pretext for advancing the thing that they really do believe in or they really do feel strongly about, which is the need to basically fuel a military offensive against Russia with the ultimate objective of toppling the Russian government. That's clearly what's going on.
Yeah, so I understand that people can use territorial integrity as a pretext for other things. When we talk about territorial integrity, we can talk about different types of integrities or different types of sovereignties, like the right to not have an enemy military in your borders, the right to not be fucked with by enemy countries in different ways or other countries in different ways. But there is a very specific idea of a country coming in and stealing land from you that in general, I think the world has kind of moved past for at least the last 30 years. It's just not something that we really do anymore as countries invading other countries and taking land from them. Now we can talk about other types of territory.
The U.S. did it in Iraq, right? I mean, I'm sorry to...
Well, in Iraq we didn't do that, though, right? That never happened, right?
Well, I mean, but the U.S. militarily occupied Iraq.
Military occupation, but we didn't take any parts of it. We didn't say that this part is now not part of Iraq. This is the United States, or this is an independent territory now. We didn't do that. We didn't mess with the borders of the country.
The U.S. had the largest military base, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that for at least quite a long time. The supposed green zone, remember where the U.S. embassy was in Baghdad? It was it was the largest piece of geographic territory that the U.S. military controlled anywhere in the world, right? So U.S. law, U.S. military law, prevailed jurisdictionally in that territory.
Well, I mean, U.S. law prevails in any military base, I think, anywhere in the world, right? If you're born in a military base in Okinawa, you're a U.S. citizen, right?
Okay, the point is, the United States did not respect the territorial integrity of Saddam Hussein. Now, maybe you could say that's a good thing or a bad thing.
I agree. We're getting hung up on this.
It wasn't the operative issue, right?
But I'm saying that, let's say the United States would have said, by the way, Kurdistan is now a separate country. That's our country now. And they would have broken that territory off from Iraq. I'm not saying that what we did before, obviously it was a war, wasn't a violation of
Kosovo and Serbia.
Sure. Kosovo
unilaterally declared independence in 2008. The United States, over the objections of Serbia, over the objections of Russia, the United States, because it's the most powerful country, then marshals diplomatic support to actually acknowledge that declaration of independence. And territorial integrity was of no concern, at least as regards Serbia.
We can do a separate.
Again, it's always just incidental. That's what I'm saying.
No, yeah, I understand, but we're hopping topics. Okay, so we can talk about Kosovo as a separate thing if you want. I believe that Declaration of
We don't have to
Independence.
we don't have to go deep into Kosovo. Yeah.
Sure, okay, but I'm just saying that even Kosovo's Declaration of Independence, something that was largely supported by the international community, and again, is fundamentally different than like a country coming in and saying like, this is our land now. And I'm not saying that like America or every country respects all of the sovereignty of all the countries at all points in time. I'm just saying there's something unique about breaking off parts of a country and declaring it as like independent or part of your territory. If we would have annexed part of Iraq, even if we were already violating their territorial sovereignty with our military bases, with our occupation, or whatever, if we would have annexed parts of Iraq, that would have been a huge deal. It would have been unprecedented. It would have been a massive elevation in our invasion, right? Like, even if the stuff happening before was bad, this would have been even worse, is all I'm saying.
Sure. Again, it's just hard to take like the fervency with which people proclaim that they, revere territorial integrity that serious. I mean, you brought up a great example to that effect, Guantanamo Bay. I mean, do you think that exists at the pleasure of the Cuban government? I mean, it's it's just there's an example for example again. I'm not denying that there are unique aspects to what Russia's doing in Ukraine. Obviously, there are. I mean, but I just don't really buy that it's somehow like this ultimate validation of this like deep-seated belief in the ultimate need to preserve territorial integrity that's guiding like the impassioned enthusiasm around this issue. I think ultimately what it boils down to, at least to the U.S., and maybe definitely Poland, Baltic states, where I was when the war started, I went to Poland for a couple weeks and then elsewhere, and I think a lot of the fervency. I think there is some. I mean, as the war has gone on, there is some particularized sort of emotional investment in Ukraine as such. But the ultimate driver of the fervency, and I mean, the utter fervency with which this war has been followed was incredible. I looked at there was a study by this guy who just like logs what every U.S. nightly news show covers each day, and the amount of coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February, March 2022 dwarfed coverage in terms of ultimate airtime of the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. I mean, people got mega.
But I mean, it's because you've got a European country that's being invaded by Russia. Yeah. Do you think that it's fair, or how can we say that it's fair that Ukraine should just accept that a country that was forced to give up its nuclear weapons is a country now that when Russia invades and takes Crimea, that Ukraine just needs to accept that going forward? How can we tell a country that sorry, you kind of got invaded and you lost that part and now that's just gone?
Well, I mean, just to quickly finish the point I was making, I think the reason for that fervency, even as absurd as it sometimes seems, like really more coverage than Iraq invasion, that seems a bit odd. But I mean, the reason for the fervency, I think, is largely a function of the ideological fervency with which a lot of people view like the current geopolitical role of Russia. Like Russia is this, that's why they always bring up World War II, Hitler. Like people think Putin is Hitler 2.0, and so there's this like existential urgency required to combat him. Also, he's going to blitzkrieg through the rest of Europe and that kind of thing. I think that explains a lot of like the kind of moral, at least purported moral passions around this issue. In terms of like what Ukraine ought to have accepted, I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't be in a position where I'm instructing certain countries what they ought to do.
But I mean, that's kind of what, if we're talking like a diplomatic solution, that's kind of what we're at, right? We're basically telling Ukraine like, hey, you need to accept this, right?
Well, I mean, you talk about the Ukraine agency thing. So people sometimes frame the conflict as like U.S. versus Russia, and that like sort of neglects the agency of Ukraine. That's a point I hear a lot. I think that people would make that point maybe reflects somewhat of a lack of understanding of what U.S. policy has actually been in Ukraine, because it's been underplayed, or it's been maybe like not quite as like the magnitude of it hasn't been emphasized in the way it should be. And it's not just that the U.S. is, quote, giving aid to Ukraine. I even think the word aid itself is sort of like euphemistic and probably propagandistic, because I mean the word aid just seems to connote like first aid kits or something. I mean, the U.S. has more or less single-handedly, not entirely single-handedly, but mostly single-handedly, orchestrated and subsidized and operationally coordinated the entire Ukraine war effort. The U.S. is the chief. I mean, I was there when the war started, where I could actually see the United States military installation that had just been created in this city in Poland, Yeshiv, where they're actually coordinating the plane shipments coming in from like different NATO
I'm sure
states.
the United States
the U.S. doing it.
The
Ultimately.
United States is definitely doing a lot. I don't think I would say the United States is single-handedly. Now, we're definitely a huge financial backer, but I don't think the United States is single-handedly coordinating the Ukrainian war effort, right?
I mean, more not. I mean, single-handedly, maybe you could quibble with that term.
I would quibble a lot.
Otherwise,
I don't
huge. I mean, hugely the most significant external player by many.
That might be the case. Sure, most significant. But I mean, a lot of other countries are contributing as well. But sure, well,
another way. Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, but they're cooperating under the aegis of the United States, like with with respect to NATO. Or I mean, so the U.S. is the one who's like organizing the international effort, such as it exists. So it all kind of comes back to the U.S. But another way to think about it, why is it that when when Russia rather issued that like ultimatum style demand in December of 2021, why is it that they sent it to the U.S. and not to Brussels or Kiev or Timbuktu? Well, it's because the only state that had the power to do something conceivably to redress the grievance that Russia was presenting was the United States, because it's the one who is the relevant military power as relates to Ukraine. So yeah, I mean, if there were to be a diplomatic settlement of any kind, I think it's almost certainly a total misconception to say that it could just be arrived at bilaterally between Ukraine and Putin somehow. I mean,
well, I mean, if Ukraine was willing to settle,
by definition it would have to involve the United States.
Well, if Ukraine was like, "No, we're done fighting," I don't think the United States would force them. Like, "No, you're fighting until this war is over," right? I think the issue is that Ukraine wants to have their territory back because it's their country, and everybody in 91 onwards, Russia included, agreed to it. So I think Ukraine has the right to be like, yeah, we want help until then. And if that is the case, the United States is going to be a big leader in coordinating that help to Ukraine. So of course you're going to have to negotiate with Ukraine or with the United States if you want, Ukraine to stop getting help. But if Ukraine wanted to stop fighting, I don't think the United States would force the issue and be like, no, you're locked in this war forever.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, I guess one way to think about it is this: if tomorrow the United States just decided to withdraw support from Ukraine completely, right? I mean, what do you think would happen?
Well, at this point, I truly don't know. I'm not actually sure at this point in the war.
Maybe it's not a great. Well, let's say they never got involved at all, like when the invasion happened.
Sure,
right?
then Ukraine likely, without Western support, would have failed for sure.
Right. So the U.S. in that sense is pretty much the prime mover, at least in terms of the military situation. Not to say that there's no impact by like whatever tenacity the Ukrainian military has, or certain know-how that they could demonstrate, but fundamentally in terms of like the ultimate power dynamic, it's the United States and Russia. And I think this sort of appeal to Ukrainian agency a lot of times tends to be like a deflection tactic to like divert scrutiny from U.S. policy. So even Biden himself does this. He did it this week. He said he repeated this like a catchphrase that Anthony Blinken taught him, where he says like nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, which means that the U.S. is not going to make any decisions that could possibly thwart what Ukraine says it wants to do, which is like ridiculous because I mean nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. That itself is a policy decision made by the U.S. right? So it's not Ukraine trumping the U.S. It's the U.S. willfully sort of outsourcing policy judgment to Ukraine. So for some reason, even though the U.S. is on the hook for like $70 billion, that the U.S. citizens are at as greater nuclear risk than at any time since Cuban Missile Crisis.
Sure. And, which is the fault of Russia, not Ukraine or the United States, right?
Well, I mean, it's the fault of Russia if Russia fires a nuclear missile at the United States, and that ultimately is the fault of Russia who pulled the trigger. But I mean, it's kind of the United States, the U.S. and Russia are the two largest nuclear armed powers. Actually, Russia's arsenal is larger, so they always have acted.
But yeah, I know what you mean.
Well, I mean, if you look at like the official data, I mean, I don't know. I haven't inspected the nuclear arsenal.
Sure. I was just saying, like Russia had also the second most fearsome military in the world too, but I just don't know like how much is on paper versus how much is functional. But no, yeah, they have a huge nuclear arsenal, of course, yeah.
Right. So I mean, it's always since 1945, it's always been a tit for tat type dynamic between the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia in terms of how they sort of manage their like nuclear relations.
Sure.
So this idea that of course, if Russia does something, I mean, if Putin does something absolutely insane, which I don't rule out, because war makes people crazy, which is actually why you may want to consider prioritizing some sort of diplomatic settlement or at least some cessation to hostilities, because as wars go on, all sides involved, tend to get crazier and crazier, less amenable to reason, and even broaden their war aims. Zelensky and Putin have both broadened their war aims since February,
Well,
which is not great because it makes
wait, is that true?
Settlement less tenable. Yeah,
I thought
well,
Russia hasn't Russia continually narrowed their aims? Because I think Russia's initial goal was a conquering of Kyiv. Then it changed to just the Donbass and Crimea, and now it's changed to like trying to get peace. Because it's starting to look like they could potentially even lose Crimea. So I think Russia has become less ambitious. I would argue that seems to be the case, unless I've missed something.
Well, I mean, when the invasion was launched, Putin disclaimed that Russia was at least seeking. So I'm saying this is just in terms of what the leaders have said, not like the ultimate metaphysical reality. In terms of what Putin said the war aims were, he disclaimed that Russia sought to like conquer any Ukrainian territory. Right now, he's explicit that Russia does seek to annex territory. So that's now an explicit war aim, and hence the annexation. And then in terms of like the Ukraine side of things, which is functionally the U.S. side, with Ukraine as a sort of a proxy, not to deny their agency, but just to reflect the reality of how they have their military power at this point. When the war started, like Zelensky and top Ukrainian officials were much more bearish about what could be accomplished. Like initially, it was sort of far-fetched that there could be any kind of offensive into Crimea. Like people thought like that was going way too far. That Russia could actually might be doing a nuclear strike on account of that. Now, I mean, over time, as the war dragged on, as passions intensify and like animus, solidifies. Retaking Crimea. You saw like, I mean, I think it was in June that like, I think it was the Ukrainian head of military intelligence or some military official was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying, yeah, we're going to get Crimea. But like, it could have just been one guy, who knows? But more and more that idea gained momentum, and now it's crystallized into what appears to be, the officially stated, policy of like the Ukraine war effort, such as it exists. They're going to retake Crimea. So that's an expansion of war aims. And yeah, it's not surprising. This is what happens. I mean, the U.S. radically expanded its war aims between 1941 and 1945.
Sure,
I mean,
I think there's
like
in
1945, it wasn't like assumed that they were going to like obliterate all of Germany.
To be clear, when we say this, there's this kind of, again, there's normative loading when we say they're expanding their aims. It makes it sound like they're getting like the territorial conquest bloodlust grows as the Ukraine. But like the expanded aims just include the territory that they had prior to 2014, right? It's their territory. Well, so I mean,
I'm not trying to load it normatively. I'm trying to just describe it, descriptively.
Sure, I know. Yeah, initially they didn't. They thought that maybe, hopefully, they could just survive for a winter, and then it changed to like, holy shit, maybe we can actually like defend ourselves. And then it changed to holy shit, maybe we can start taking back some of our land. Then it changed to like, holy shit, maybe we can take back all of our land. Right? Is what it's slowly morphed to over time. But I don't think any of that morphing is bad. And then I'd argue largely it's due to U.S. support, which I agree. But I don't. I feel like. I guess ultimately, to Vaush you, because this is kind of the question now that we've kind of talked around this. Okay. Like, do you think
nice verb, by the way.
What?
It's a nice verb.
Oh, yeah. I guess, like, ultimately, so I'm kind of curious, do you think that U.S. involvement in this Ukrainian conflict, do you think it was a good thing? Or to go back to the question that I asked you before, that I didn't get an answer to, like, do you think that, like, Ukraine should just say, like, no, you have to give up Crimea, like, you've lost that now? Like, what was the U.S. involvement so far ultimately a good thing, or is it not? Do you think that, like, no, we should have just left it alone? And should Ukraine be forced to just give up part of their land?
Should Ukraine be forced to give up part of their land? I'm not in a position to tell any nation state what to do. I mean, it just seems like I'm not sort of.
I mean, we kind of are though, right? Because we're the U.S. Well, we kind of make, because you are right. We do make that decision. That really, the Ukraine survives. Not to take any away from the Ukrainians, who are very brave people, but they basically thrive, or they exist under the like assistance, the foreign assistance that the United States has given them, right? Yeah. So like, so the United States essentially making the decision. Like, should we have been like, sorry, Ukraine, like, that's just how the cookie crumbles. Like,
yes, yeah. Overall, my attitude toward U.S. policy issues as relates to Russia and then I guess Ukraine as sort of like an offshoot has been that the ultimate bad outcome would be nuclear calamity, right? I don't know. It's not it didn't used to be a controversial statement. Now people think if you say that, it means you're propagandizing for the Kremlin. Actually, Vaush said that explicitly yesterday. I think it used to be. I mean, it used to be like one of the most conventional views in American politics, pretty much bipartisan. That the policy should be judged in relation to not increasing the risk of nuclear calamity versus increasing
I agree.
risk.
I will say,
that would be like that would kind of guide my judgments on this sort of thing. And so
could I say insofar as a
I can't
nuclear
say for
calamity
sure,
thing?
like if like one particular option on Crimea would like be more risky versus another. I don't know. I would have to be like more in the weeds in terms of like the minutia of the policy.
Sure. Let me just on the nuclear calamity thing, because that's the thing that gets brought up a lot. Okay, I feel like there are worse things than nuclear calamity, and people
like what?
People immediately, of course, that's fine. So people immediately will say like nukes, that's really bad. Nukes where we're at right now would probably be pretty bad. I would agree that would be a really bad thing. But I can think of two things that are worse. One thing that would be worse is
January 6th, I think, would be worse.
Well, nice one. I was actually going to say Trump's Twitter account. No, but so two things could be worse. One would be Russia taking over all of Ukraine, owning all of Ukraine, then moving to take over another country, and then at that point we go to fight, and then a nuclear conflict happens when Russia has already enjoyed some military success and put themselves in an even better position to enact more nuclear violence in the future. And I would argue that Ukraine, I'm going to use that horrible word appeasement, that the appeasement of Russia by giving them Ukraine could theoretically embolden them for future military conflict, which could actually increase the likelihood for nuclear conflict in the future. So that would be one worse outcome than nuclear conflict, than potential nuclear conflict right now. A second worse outcome would be the idea that the rules of the world are such that if you have nuclear arms, you basically have unfettered access to your borders. You can go and invade whoever you want, take their shit, and that's the way of the world in the future. And then we're all warring and fighting with each other, and then invariably that will lead to some nuclear conflict as well, either involving India or Israel or Russia or Germany, France, some other nuclear power. And I would argue that those are two highly possible outcomes if we kind of go down this road of acquiescing to Russia, being like, oh, well, we've got nukes, so we can do whatever we want. I think that those are realistic possibilities that we should be actively thinking about.
I'm not clear on how Ukraine being obliterated in a nuclear annihilation would be less bad than like a couple of provinces in the east of Ukraine being annexed by Russia. Not that I'm endorsing the annexation. It just seems like, everyone in Ukraine dead and incinerated is worse.
Well, so like here's the question is, let's say that they took those territories from Ukraine. Why would we expect it to stop there?
Maybe you couldn't expect it to stop there, but again, the nuclear scenario, everybody's dead anyway.
Yeah, but like this is always the issue of like negotiating with terrorists. This is the concept, right? Let's say that we say, okay, fuck it, you can have that. Well, what if Russia sets its eyes on like Romania or Poland or Hungary or some other country, or they look to south to Azerbaijan or some other Euro-Asian country, or Georgia? They want to go even further into Georgia, right? At some point, you agree we have to pump the brakes. We're like, okay, hold on, dude. Just because you have nukes doesn't mean you can do this. Like, and then what? They're just going to nuke in the future from an even stronger position? Now, again, contemplating between nuclear future A and nuclear future B is pretty dark. But if they're the ones that are aggressing, like, well, fuck, what do you do? Like, why would we expect Russia to stop at Crimea when they've done the same thing in Moldova, when they've done the same thing in Georgia, and when they're doing the same thing now in Ukraine, and when the Soviet Union has a history of doing stuff like this?
That's another whole other can of worms, because like the ideological nature of the current Russian state, bears very little relation to the Soviet project.
Does it?
But it doesn't matter. But that's.
I was going to say, to be clear, Putin said the collapse of the Soviet Union was like the biggest geopolitical disaster in history. I think he said.
Well, yeah, he said that. I mean, that.
And then he's also kind of sort of building on this concept of like, I think he calls it the Union State with the Russia, Belarus, and he wanted to include Ukraine in it, and they're kind of like new trade union. It's not exactly the Soviet Union, but like it's kind of.
Well, that was a. He did say that in 2005 in a quote that gets incessantly repeated and, pretty much not properly contextualized. I mean, my reading of that quote is that he was not like pining for like the glory of like the Soviet ideological project or of, communism or something. He was saying that the dissolution of the Soviet Union resulted in kind of the sudden separation of peoples of shared kind of ethnic or heritage and so forth, who are like divided among like sort of arbitrary state boundaries. And I mean,
I agree with what you're saying.
The dissolution of the Soviet Union was bad in this sense, in that it precipitated the absolute worst economic crisis maybe in Russia's history ever. I mean, life expectancy, I think, went to like 55 years old for something for men. I mean, it was
economically it was bad, but it also spoke to something that Dugin had written about, the political guy whose daughter was killed, and something that Putin believes, and that there was also this great separation of like the Russian identity, that there were all these Russians that were lost in other countries, and that the overall dissolution of the Soviet Union like fractured them as a people. And it's been a while since I've read that speech, but I think he even points to like separatist movements that are growing in like Chechnya and stuff. He was saying like, look at this, like the Soviet Union collapsing was a disaster for everybody involved. But you have to be careful, because that same argument was also one that was used as a pretext for the invasion of Ukraine. Well, look, these are our people. These are our Russians. We need to go down there and save them. Like it's that we're I think he even says like we're one blood. Or there's like a phrase in Russia that he used to describe it. There was a speech that was accidentally leaked. Maybe you think it's fake or not, but there was a speech that was accidentally leaked from Russia saying like it's a good thing that we've reunified, that we've are one body and one mind and one soul and all this shit or whatever again. So when he says that collapse,
Putin put out a written like essay manifesto type thing in July of 2021, where he did go into this whole like historical.
So I'm saying that speech and that collapse does kind of make it sound like he's looking to like rebuild that Russian soul. And I mean, like when you look at how Belarus functions in relation to Russia, and you look at what they wanted to do with Ukraine, it kind of looks like it. I'm just saying it's definitely something to be thinking about, right?
Yeah, it's unclear. I don't think it would be particularly warranted though to say that, because counterfactually it could happen, or like in the future this could happen where Putin does a blitzkrieg through Romania or something like that. Unknown and unprovable future scenario would potentially be worse than what we know the effect of a nuclear incident would be, which is like,
well, but we don't know if nuclear incident will happen. But like he's taken Crimea. No. That he invaded and stole a country. That's not good.
But if it did happen, we know what it would do, right? Okay, so but on the point of like, okay, so you can't. It would be so bad to appease this tyrant just because he has a nuclear arsenal, right? That would be a horrible precedent to set. The thing is, again, I think it's very selective or circumstantial that people somehow suddenly feel this way, because I mean the U.S. does in a sense appease various world powers just by dint of them having nuclear weapons. I mean, when George W. Bush declared the axis of evil, in 2002,
so stupid.
One of the axis power, part of that axis was North Korea, which had nuclear weapons, and George W. Bush, even though he was asserting that North Korea was just as evil as Iraq and Iran, George W. Bush never sought to militarily, encroach on North Korea, probably because he didn't want to provoke a nuclear incident. So he chose, Iraq, and said, obviously that's an oversimplification. And then, went, hard on Iran on using other methods to sort of constrain them. But like North Korea, he argued, got a bit of a pass. You could even say that, Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-un, who was the father?
Kim Jong-il, right? Wasn't it Kim Jong-il?
Kim Jong-il, sorry. Kim Il-sung was Kim Jong-il's father. Yeah, Kim Jong-il, you could say he was appeased because he was treated relatively more in a lax way than like Saddam Hussein. I mean, I think that would be a stupid way of putting it. I mean, in other words, I wouldn't allege that George W. Bush appeased Kim Jong-il on those grounds. But, and then
I agree. I will say just real quick on this. Because it is true that like having the nuclear weapons gives you some defensive integrity. I would agree with that. But the problem is when you start using that offensively, we're in a whole different world now, right? Like we've agreed in the world right now, okay, fuck it. You've got nukes, you don't get fucked with, which is one of the reasons why NATO is so cool, because you've got a friend with nukes on your side. But when somebody starts using the nuclear arsenal to invade other countries, that gets like really fucked, right? Like North Korea hasn't invaded South Korea or something, because at that point, appeasement doesn't work. We have to stop. We've got to find a different solution, I think. Right? Because we can't just say that the rules are if you've got nukes, you can do whatever you want. Because like the whole world is going to be like, well, fuck, we all need to get nukes now because, that's how, I guess that's what the rules are. I think that's a really scary place to be in.
Yeah.
And I think arguably it leads to more nuclear proliferation in the future, which increases the likelihood of like an eventual nuclear catastrophe.
Yeah. And maybe this is another quote defensive example, but it's an illuminating one nevertheless. Pakistan. I mean, the Al Qaeda, such as it existed when the United States invaded, the ones who actually perpetrated the 9/11 attacks, the ones that were still around, they fled to Pakistan, right? I mean, that's where we found they found Bin Laden eventually.
Yep.
In 2011. George W. Bush, supposedly his whole doctrine was, any nation that harbors terrorists was going to be treated like the terrorists themselves, and we're going to go and do, regime change. And yet, somehow Pakistan, which had like a military coup government for quite a while, somehow, despite quote unquote potentially being alleged to have harbored terrorists, and there is a lot of evidence. I mean, read Seymour Hersh on this, that the Pakistani intelligence services pretty much did harbor Bin Laden for quite a long time, at least tacitly, and yet this was never seen as cause to attack like the central government of Pakistan.
Sure, because they've got nuclear weapons, right?
So, well, yeah. I mean, that seems like a.
But if Pakistan started invading neighboring countries,
yeah,
we'd have a huge problem now, right? Like this is why I'm going back to that territorial integrity thing. When you start invading people with nuclear arms, shit gets really weird. And that just setting that rule book, again, I return to my question, like, can we really tell Ukraine to just say tough luck, they've got nukes, so you kind of just have to give your shit up?
Okay, so then say we must not appease Putin in Ukraine, so what therefore do we do? Well, I mean, that's a whole separate issue, right? Because appeasement is always like a moving sort of target. Like, there's no like set criteria for what constitutes appeasement versus what doesn't. Before the Ukraine war, the invasion was launched, Biden was being denounced by some of the Republican hawks, like Joni Ernst, the senator from Iowa, as an appeaser for being insufficiently aggressive in arming Ukraine, sending certain weapon systems even at that point. So was Biden appeasing Putin in February of 2022? I don't know. That allegation seemed kind of ridiculous to me. It was coming from like a sort of a partisan angle, but there's also like a actual ideological imperative behind it for these Republican hawks. But it gets used so like flippantly and capriciously that you can't. It's not like you can.
Sure, so we don't have
allegations of appeasement by appealing to any like set standard of what appeasement is.
Yeah, so I'm not worried.
In this situation is like a perpetual U.S. military intervention in Ukraine, which, by the way, we learned recently entails a secret deployment by Biden of U.S. special forces that have gotten more extensive as the war has gone on.
I don't know about the
and these arms provisions.
I don't know about the U.S. special forces thing. I'm not 100% sold on that. But I know that the Intercept reported that.
The Intercept,
yeah, I know, but nobody else has reported that, and I'm curious what the details are of those U.S. Special Forces are, because like there's so much mobile footage, there's so much info leaking out of Ukraine. I find it really hard to believe that there's like an extensive like operation on the ground with U.S. Special Forces that nobody's picked up on, nobody's reported on.
I don't find it hard to believe at all. I mean, there's a huge. I mean, I was there. I mean, I wasn't in physically Ukraine, but I like talked to a lot of people coming in and out, like who were like involved in different defense contractor roles and aid roles and stuff, or like I talked to like Defense Department staff who were performing like auxiliary functions to aid the war effort by the U.S., which is, again, I mean, the under emphasis on the U.S. centrality of this is just mind-boggling if you actually go there and see it for yourself.
Well, if you go there and see it for yourself, you see,
it
like,
wouldn't surprise me at all, because like they have this giant arms provision operation.
Yeah, to be fair, like, when we say U.S. centrality, Ukraine has been fighting against Russian-backed separatist movements in their country since 2014.
Sure.
The United States hasn't been backing Ukraine with special forces on the ground since 2014. They've been fighting that conflict largely or a lot on their own. Yes, they've gotten like independent help.
I was talking about from February of this year.
Sure, I understand. I'm just saying that
U.S. military in the country for.
Sure, I'm just saying that Ukraine is doing the lion's share of the fighting. Of course, there's going to be coordination of like stuff. But again, returning to it, and I understand, like, I'm not really worried about like the political ramifications of appeasement. I'm looking at more like the macro foreign policy level of like, do we tell Putin that you get to keep Crimea because you invaded it and you have nuclear weapons? Or do we tell Ukraine, we're going to do whatever we can to enable you guys to fight like hell to assert the territory that you rightfully own, that Russia recognized along with the rest of the world in 91? Like, because that's a decision that we have to make. Again, I don't care about like the political implications of, well, people are going to say you're a appeaser, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, there is a real question of, should Ukraine be allowed to defend its territory, or should we pull out and not enable them to do so? And I feel like it feels like we kind of have to, like, why would we not help them assert their right to exist? Yeah.
I guess one of my issues here is this dichotomization of like the relevant policy calculus between appeasement, which is, bad, another synonym for bad in the popular lexicon. It's appeasement versus, standing with Ukraine or aiding with Ukraine, right? So apparently we've been doing the standing with Ukraine or aiding with Ukraine as opposed to appeasement since February. And what has it brought about? Well, I mean, you got expansion of the conflict in a fairly significant sense, geographically, and the expansion of the war aims. Both sides, I mean, in terms of Ukraine being one of the sides versus Russia, they've gotten much more maximalist in their rhetoric. They seem to be getting more unhinged, frankly. I mean, Zelensky called for a first strike against.
Good things. I think the issue that we're having is we're assuming like, well, these are bad, but it feels like your only marker for bad in your mind is anything that moves us closer to nuclear war is bad. But that's like, that's going to be, that's Putin's line, right? That's what Putin wants you to think is that like, well, if you do anything, I could push the button, so you better acquiesce to every single demand I make. And I don't think that's a reasonable way to do foreign policy. We can't allow ourselves to be bullied like that, I don't think.
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be just nuclear war as like the ultimate barometer for whether the policy is worthwhile. I mean, I think it's even just bad unto itself in a way to be at such in a scenario of such heightened nuclear risk. I mean, Leon Panetta, who was the defense secretary and CIA director under Obama, put out like a shocking guest article for Politico where he's saying there's a 25% chance now of nuclear war, which is like, okay, so 1 in 4 chance of nuclear war. I mean, I almost feel like I'm going crazy sometimes because I feel like anybody who's like mentally sound should be really struck by that, such that, I mean, they should probably focus on this issue and like figure out like what the deal is, like if anything can be done to mitigate the worst possible outcome and so forth. But it doesn't even have to go so far as nuclear war, right? So because the U.S. has been doing the opposite of appeasement. We've basically the U.S. and NATO countries are militarizing their economies. Similar to there used to be a school of thought on the left that the militarization of economies, like into like just industrial production of war armament, that was perverse for its own sake because it heightened the incentives around wanting to start wars because then you could increase profits, right? So I mean that's like one offshoot effect
sure,
of this.
But
even Macron had said if France was now in the war economy, that's one thing. But number two, and let more tangibly, there's a radical lack of transparency, and this maybe is what most viscerally influences me. There is a radical lack of transparency as to what the scope and impact of U.S. intervention in the war. And I think that's sort of corrosive unto itself because the citizens are not being given an opportunity to actually evaluate whether they want to be put in this position where, World War III could potentially break out over the Donbass. It's all been done in this like somewhat underhanded way where it's shrouded by cliches and appeals to, standing with Ukraine and Putin is Hitler and so forth. So there's not been a reasoned debate on it. There's very good reason to believe, and I wish I could report this more overtly, but, it's very hard to confirm things, but I'm just going to be a bit vague, sorry, but I mean, there's a lot of reason to believe that stuff I picked up on the operational involvement that's been acknowledged by the U.S. is already very extensive. Like the New York Times put out that the U.S. was involved operationally in the combat mission to sink the Russian warship in the Black Sea, kill generals, even to help organize and orchestrate this counter.
Just real quick. When we say involvement, what do we mean by that?
Operational coordination is how they put it, which maybe is even itself a euphemism, meaning that they're like, real-time intelligence sharing, coordination to like pinpoint the targets and this sort of thing.
Okay, intelligence sharings are things that we are involved in, but I think the United States, I don't think there's any, that's not like a secret, right? That's like an open, we say that, right?
Yeah, but it's always imprecisely described what in detail is actually happening. Like we don't know.
We've been pretty honest. It's like basically, if the United States knows a Russian troop is somewhere, Ukraine is going to know that a Russian troop is somewhere. Like sharing of intelligence has been a cornerstone, I think, of the U.S. involvement in this. I think we've been pretty open about that.
Yeah, but the details of it have still not been nearly as forthcoming as they ought
Well, when
to
you
have
say
been.
the
I know you're.
details, I mean, we're
I know
talking
we're
about
not
like
sold.
national security. Like, we're not going to be like, hey, this is exactly what we're telling them at any point in time. That's just going to be like the
No,
nature of
no,
it.
not like not like a tactical level, but in terms of like, okay, so what are actually these U.S. forces doing in practice? Like, what is their role? There were UK special forces have been in Ukraine, as reported by the Times of London since April. Boots on the ground presence. I mean, Biden says no boots on the ground are going to be in Ukraine. Don't worry about it, everybody. And naturally, I mean, I know you don't fully buy into the Intercept article yet, but I mean,
Hmm.
I'm reasonably confident in it, and those guys are probably wearing boots and they're on the ground. So I mean, it's just the same old sort of. Uh, I would say that it is deception because
Well, hold on.
here's
I would
another
say real
thing.
quick on this, because if it was the case, there's two things that I would expect. If it was the case that there were U.S. boots on the ground, I feel like Russia would be screaming that from the rooftops, because that would be an unbelievably scary escalation of the conflict. We do not
Well,
ever want there to be a report of Russian troops have bombed or killed U.S. troops, or U.S. troops have bombed and killed Russian troops. There is a direct phone line from the Kremlin to Washington, D.C., where we make calls to make sure that that is never happening. And in my understanding, in the past like 30, 40 years, the only time it has ever happened where U.S. troops have killed Russian troops is when Russia lied about Russian troops. I think it was it was part of the Wagner group being involved in Syrian operations, and a group of, I think it was U.S. Special Forces troops called in an airstrike that killed Russian troops, but it was because they lied when they were asked to confirm that they were there. So if you are
yeah.
telling me it is the case that there are U.S. boots on the ground, we didn't do that in Syria. We historically avoid that at all costs, and it would be a massive escalation that even Russia isn't reporting on, which would be odd to me. I would expect that if that was the case, Russia would be screaming it from the rooftops.
Well, I mean, I have no evidence that there has been direct combat between any of these, special forces or Green Berets or whomever
Mm-hmm.
that might be in Ukraine that are, U.S. military personnel. I don't know of any direct combat, right? I mean, so there's not, so Russia wouldn't have anything to, scream about on that front. But I mean, Russia has been extremely aggressive in condemning the United States, even in just the speech that Putin gave last month, where he announced these annexations.
Mm-hmm.
The whole thing was basically aimed at the United States. It wasn't hardly even mentioned Ukraine. I mean, it was all basically a jeremiad against the oppressive, hegemonic, depredations of the United States.
Sure.
And
Because in some ways, this has been a conflict
the
of
war
like
was
East versus
framed.
West, right?
It's like Putin most vividly started framing the war to Russians as like basically this kind of civilizational battle with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean they have been doing that, even in just more technical terms. I mean, at the UN maybe 2 weeks ago, Sergei Lavrov, who is the Russian foreign minister, actually publicly alleged that Russia regards, like per international law, the United States to be a co-belligerent of Ukraine, and therefore, potentially, at least as far as they're concerned, a legitimate, military target for reprisal. So, I mean, it's gone further and further down that trajectory of like some sort of conflict potentially breaking out that's more direct. And so when people say, it's good that we didn't appease or we're not appeasing, and that this is the fruits of it are closer and closer to direct conflict.
Yep. And I understand, but then
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
return.
I'm ready to just sign off on that as a
I just have to ask the
practice.
question. Like, but then again, I'm curious then. So is the answer then anytime a belligerent with a nuclear arsenal like starts stirring up trouble, that they're just allowed to like progress unimpeded? Because in a way, and I'm not trying to say like because you've said this, it's everything, but that is kind of like the rule that you're establishing, that is like, okay, well, if a nuclear belligerent exists, they're allowed to proceed unimpeded, and there's just not much you can do about it. Because that seems to be what is the, because let's say that I'll say that I'm committing you to that statement. What is your escape from that? We're like, well, hold on, I don't mean that always. Like, how would you determine whether we should or shouldn't intervene?
Yeah, it's I guess, and I know if you were Vaush, you would accuse me of dodging and being a coward.
These are really complicated questions, by the way. I'm not trying to say this. Yeah, because even the question of like, what if they do nuclear strike? What do we do? That's an unanswered question, because people say, well, mutually assured destruction. Is it really? If there were 10 nukes headed to the United States, would we flip the switch and start nuking the entire? I don't know. Yeah, these are hard questions. I understand, but I mean, unfortunately, we kind of have to answer them now. Yeah.
Here's why I'm apprehensive about answering it, right? Because in order to answer it, you have to accept a couple of premises that I don't quite accept, which is that I'm in a position where I'm controlling the levers of state in the United States, which is the most powerful military state, right? And therefore can have some decision-making authority over this. If I was in India. Where which is basically neutral party to this war, or China, or pick your country, Mexico or something, which does vote against Russia, or vote to condemn Russia in the UN, but doesn't sanction it. Even Israel. I mean, it's only the United States where it's all down to us on a whim deciding what to do or what not to do. And I'm not sure.
We're the United States.
I know. I know, but I don't really
Because if we don't make these,
underline that, I'm not necessarily.
This is how the world works. If the United States doesn't make the choice, China or Russia will, right? And that's been the history of foreign policy since, I guess, 45 or the 40s and 50s onward, right? Yeah. It's either the United. That's the saying in Eastern Europe is if you ask for the United States shows up. If you ask for the Soviet Union shows up. If you don't ask for anybody, the Soviet Union shows up. People are going to be involved in these affairs. Either Russia is writing the international rule books, maybe China, or the United States is. So it's kind of on us to make the decision. India is not making decisions for what happens in Ukraine. Great Britain, or not Great Britain, the United Kingdom and France and Germany are not making those decisions. Everybody's looking to the U.S. for leadership. So in a way, it kind of is on us to make that decision, right?
Well, right. I mean, if your goal is to maintain American hegemonic primacy, that you do have to make decisions along those lines. That's why they're ramping up demonization of China. I'm not saying there's nothing about China that you could legitimately demonize. So
do we give up the U.S. hegemony? Do we say Russia gets to make the rules and we're going to just step back, or is that the correct decision?
I don't know. I mean, I know that decisions that have been historically made on the grounds that the U.S. needs to at all costs preserve its hegemony, therefore it needs to take action X, Y, or Z. Many of those decisions seem to have backfired radically. I mean, Vietnam pretty much sold on those grounds, right?
I mean, so is Korea. Korea's backfire though. South Korea's an amazing country, great U.S. ally. I mean, in some cases we've made mistakes. I would definitely agree. But I mean, the general security in Europe from '91 onwards has been really, really, really positive. The relationships we built around the world have been really positive. Well, a lot of foreign policy steps that we've made.
Serbians would disagre with that, but yeah.
Yes, Serbians would be the only people that NATO has intervened with that have hugely negative opinions of NATO and the United States, of course. But I mean, all the people that the Serbians were genociding would probably disagree with Serbia's opinion on that, or actually, right?
Here's my issue with the Ukraine, with U.S. intervention in Ukraine, such as it exists, right? Or here's one of my main issues.
Sure.
The history of U.S. foreign policy tell us, or ought to tell us, if you're a conscientious student of it, or analyzer of it, that U.S. interventions have a very noted tendency to expand in their scope over time, or to not be exactly forthrightly presented to the American public. This is even true of World War II, which is why people get angry at me, because I talk about this actually being pretty self-evidently true in World War II. We don't have to get into that, but that's just what happens. That's just the nature of U.S. projections of U.S. military power, right? So when the invasion of Ukraine happened in February, how did Biden sort of portray what U.S. policy would be? Well, the U.S. was just going to send some, small arms and javelin missiles strictly so the Ukrainian people could defend themselves, right? And then, of course, that arouses a pretty relatable, moral instinct in most people. Okay, yeah, of course, this country's been invaded. We should help them defend themselves. And of course, I see that. And because I'm trying to be a little bit more far-sighted, not that everybody else is a dope, but I probably have a little bit more foreign policy knowledge than the average citizen. I see that, and I say, okay, well, yeah, it looks like this is liable to be the beginning sort of link in a escalatory chain, and that should be pointed out and should be scrutinized and should be debated, and it shouldn't be just any kind of objection or reservation shouldn't automatically be stigmatized as you're paid by the Kremlin or whatever, or you're a fascist, or all the other litany of accusations. And because sure enough, that's what happened. By June, Zelensky's government was requesting, and the U.S. was more or less acceding to, the idea that basically, it wasn't just a couple of, RPG, a couple of like, assault rifles and Javelin missiles. By June, so a couple months after the invasion, a couple after the U.S. makes this unflinching, unwavering, limitless military commitment to Ukraine, all of a sudden the U.S. is now effectively subsidizing a brand new military for Ukraine. So that is not the nature of the commitment that was initially portrayed to the public by Biden. Actually, what was portrayed to the public was that U.S. intervention was going to constrain or limit the severity of the conflict, right? It was going to constrain it. It was going to be a deterrent. And now, we're in October, and the severity of the conflict seems to have expanded such that Biden himself is warning, and he just repeated it actually a couple of days ago, that we're on the cusp of nuclear Armageddon. So I mean, at what point did we get to evaluate whether the policy actually served the purposes that it was sold to the public is going to serve?
So I agree with the historical analysis here, and now I'm going to attack you on your historical analysis, because I agree that when people bring up World War II and stuff, they're always like, oh, it's just like Hitler, and that's bullshit. There are bad parallels to draw here, okay? But I do think that it is right that we analyze some of the missteps that the United States has made, especially, obviously, we're going to talk about Iraq and Afghanistan. And in my mind, I believe that there are three huge missteps that mark foreign policy failure with the United States when it came to Iraq and Afghanistan. Number one was mission creep. We did not have a clearly defined mission going in and out of Afghanistan, and arguably even Iraq. What was supposed to be the ousting of a leader, the attacking of some terrorists turned into building countries in ways that we were not equipped to do. That was number one. Number two was a lack of transparency. Were there WMDs in Iraq? Which countries are we going into? What's our plan afterwards? It didn't seem like there was very much transparency to the American public for what was going on. Number two, and then number three, this tendency of the United States to go at it alone, to say, fuck the UN, fuck NATO, this is the United States going to do this shit. We were very much in charge of these things, sometimes to the chagrin of other allies, especially NATO skeptic allies like France. I remember you referencing freedom fries before because of how pissed off France was about U.S. intervention in the Middle East. These are
that's how pissed off Americans were at France for not backing the invasion. Yeah.
So I would say these are the three, in my mind, I'm not an expert or anything, but I would say, in my personal opinion, these are like the three principal failings of U.S. foreign policy in regards to how we treat the Middle East. Now, when I look at how Biden has treated Ukraine, I feel like all three of those foreign policy blunders have been entirely ameliorated, and I believe that he's acting in a satisfactory way. So number one, mission creep. It is my understanding, and I could be wrong, I can go back and look at speeches Biden given, I think that Biden very clearly said in the beginning, the United States is going to support Ukraine in every way up to troops on the ground. The United States is not putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. The United States is not going to be flying planes over. We're not doing a no-fly zone. We're not shooting missiles. We're going to send you a fuck ton of arms. Maybe we'll help you learn how to use them, but that's it. So the mission creep is there. We're supporting, or it's not there. We've got our clear mission. It's defined, and that hasn't expanded in my understanding. There's been no expansion. Number one. Number two, transparency. The United States was leaking intel about what Russia was going to do before Russia did it. I think the United States has been we haven't made false claims about Russia's going to do that. They're not going to do that. We haven't been hiding intel. We've been very open with the entire world in terms of what's going on. And number three, Biden did a really good job at building a coalition of countries to go at it with Ukraine to resist Russia. Poland has done a ton of arms shipments and training. We've gotten Europe on board with banning parts of Russia from parts of the SWIFT banking system. We've gotten people to be okay with pretty big tariffs on Russia, even in ways that are harming their economy. Biden has done a really good job at building a coalition to get the entire world, at least the Western world, on board with the U.S. mission here. So in that sense, when I look at how Biden has treated Ukraine, I understand that we've had failings in the past as far as foreign policy goes, but I feel like Biden has done a really good job at addressing those failures and treating Ukraine in a much different way than we would have treated Iraq or Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, I think virtually all of that is dead wrong. So
okay, go for it. Which one? Yeah.
Okay, so on like mission creep, right? There are a number of examples I could give. I mean, we talked about the operational coordination of the U.S. I mean, it's basically a joint U.S.-Ukraine military operation at this time. Not that I'm not saying that means actually like infantrymen with American insignia firing upon Russian soldiers. Not that, but like in practice, it's a joint operation. But also, I mean, so when Biden announced that the U.S. is going to do this sort of mode of military intervention in Ukraine when the invasion was launched, he said nothing about potentially seeking to, like, I don't know, overthrow the government of Russia, right? But then Biden it gave one of like his legacy speeches, one of the most significant speeches that's going to be looked back on over the course of his entire tenure as president. And I think it was March 26th in Warsaw, Poland, where at the climax of the speech, he announces, he demands regime change in Russia. He says Putin must go, more or less, right? But he said, I think he said, my God, this man cannot remain in power. And
okay,
it wasn't
but
just
what,
like,
what is that?
let me just finish real quick.
Yeah, go for
And
it.
of course, that was quote walked back, right? But then, Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, in April goes to Ukraine and he says, what U.S. policy is aimed to do is to weaken Russia so they can no longer do anything like this. And fast forward, everything that the U.S. has done, whatever walk back that White House press aides sent to the email inboxes of reporters, which then get tweeted, everything that the U.S. has done policy-wise since then has been consistent with the objective that the only real way out of this is to foster, in some sense, regime change in Russia. So, I mean, let me just illustrate that in terms of what's happened very recently. Zelensky, who doesn't do anything if it's going to like outright contravene the wishes of the United States, right? He does it in accordance with the United States. They're his chief sponsor. He put out a presidential decree, which is like a formal statement of presidential policy, where he explicitly declared that no negotiations could be possible at all with Russia so long as Putin is in power. So what does that mean? The only way to have a resolution to the conflict is if there's regime change in Russia. And that's what the U.S. is enabling the pursuit of by way of its limitless military commitment to Ukraine. So that's an expansion. That's a giant mission creep.
No. Hold on. I just want to question. So firstly, no. The United States does not have it as part of its mission to regime change in Russia. These are comments
That's what Biden said.
Biden has made comments about Putin because Putin is talking about nuking things, but we don't have it as part of our mission to enact regime change in Russia. Now, you can argue that that seems to be the path that it's going, but I would argue that one country and one country alone is contributing to regime change in Russia more than any other country, and that would be Russia. The United States didn't make Russia invade Ukraine. The United States didn't make Russia, take Crimea. The United States didn't make Russia send troops into the Donbass. Like, this is all Putin. So you can say on one hand that like, wow, like it's kind of like a guy going into a bar with a knife and he's just like chilling in the corner. He's like, man, if somebody fucks me up, I'm gonna stab him. But he's like chilling in the corner, and then all of a sudden a huge guy goes up to him and is like, I'm gonna beat the shit out of you, I'm gonna fucking kill you. And the guy goes to attack him, and the guy stabs him, and you're like, hold on, that guy went into the bar to stab somebody. It's like, I mean, like he said he was going to, maybe, but like the other dude attacked him. Like, it's 100% that guy's fault. Right? So you can argue that the United States might have the aim of like, well, we want to weaken Russia. And insofar as Russia is like a crazy, quasi-fascist, quasi-crazy fucking state, I don't even think that's necessarily a bad aim. But it's not like we've done things or gone out of our way to fuck Russia up. Russia's tripping all over itself on its own. Like, Russia's the one that's making all these mistakes. We didn't make Russia invade Ukraine.
No, of course. I mean, I didn't say anything like that and wouldn't. And it may well be the case that Putin or, other Russian government officials could be taking actions which serve to jeopardize the stability of the government and maybe even potentially lead to regime change. But that would have nothing to do per se with whether the U.S. is also pursuing that objective from its own.
But what has the U.S. done
which it plainly is?
What has the U.S. done to like enforce or try to hit regime change in Russia, though?
Well, I mean, you should Google. I mean, from March, there was an article by Neil Ferguson who was quoting anonymous sources, and a reasonably, reliable person, quoting an anonymous administration official who was just characterizing the purpose of U.S. policy at that point. And what Neil Ferguson, Bloomberg columnist, wrote was that according to the senior U.S. Biden administration official, the whole idea was to, quote, bleed Russia dry by essentially protracting the war, making Russia expend resources, thereby weakening the government and creating an opening where somehow regime change could be effectuated, whether it was purely internally, whether it was maybe some kind of external force applied, not clearly defined, but that was the ultimate objective, right? And and like, again, everything since has been consistent with that. I even heard,
but if that's the objective, it's being accomplished by Russia. They're the ones doing it.
I even heard from around that same time by people in the U.S. military that, I mean, that the idea was this supposed aid program was tailored toward, again, causing Russia to like deplete such that regime change could be effectuated. And in terms of like who would ultimately be at fault if the regime change did occur in Russia, well, yeah, I'm sure you could make a very good case that
Not make a very good case. It's
Russian
Russia.
actions themselves contributed to it.
Yeah, we didn't make them invade Ukraine. We're not doing anything aside from stuff related to their invasion of Ukraine.
Wait, but if the U.S. is deliberately trying to foment regime change in Russia, and the regime change happens in Russia, the U.S. had no effect on regime change happening in Russia.
Well, what have we done to try to deliberately foment that?
I just told you. I mean, they have this strategy. I mean, the
Wait,
Biden
no, hold on.
administration.
Saying that we have a strategy is not giving us.
Dry in Ukraine.
Saying that we have a strategy.
And you know they're doing it with sanctions. I mean, Boris Johnson's spokesperson said that the reasoning behind the sanctions when they were first applied in February and March was specifically to eventually lead to the ouster of the Russian,
Sure, and
government.
that's fine. They can say that, but so here's an example I could give. We might argue that Al Qaeda wanted to get the United States bogged down the Middle East. Okay, let's say that Al Qaeda does that. Okay, well, how did they do that? Well, they hijacked 4 commercial airliners and they flew in the buildings. Okay, well, shit, they did do that, right? If somebody says something, then you have to, okay, well, what are the actions they're doing to make it happen? When we say that, well, the United States is trying to enact regime change in Russia, wow, how did they do that? Well, Putin chose on his own to invade Ukraine and he's getting his ass whipped. Well, how is that the United States' fault? Like, maybe we did have that plan and maybe we would have tried to do it some other way, but like, Putin is walking into the rake over and over and over again. He's smacking someone in the face. And he's going, that's the United States. No, it's not. Obviously, we're going to support Ukraine. Obviously, the rest of Europe is going to support Ukraine because nobody likes Putin because Russia's fucking insane. But I don't think that there's any part of this that can be blamed on the United States when the actor, the moral agent, the actor here is always Putin. He's the one that is proactively making the choice to invade another country and go to war, and he's losing.
Yeah, I'm not assigning fault here or assigning blame or making really any kind of moral.
Well, you are, because you're saying the United States
No,
is the one that is fomenting, that is trying to do regime change, like it's somehow the United States is like moral responsibility or fault for what's happening in Russia. If regime change happens in Russia, that's Putin's fault. He fucked up, and he's continuing to fuck up.
But let's say that the United States does have a role in achieving the policy aim that it's setting out, which is to effectuate regime change in Russia. You could say that's good or bad. I mean, you could say that's the United States deserves blame for that or praise. I mean, there would be a lot of praise given to the U.S.
The blame would be is if
good, but it doesn't like that. The moral sort of characterization of it really is sort of a second order thing in terms of like what the actual practical effect of this.
Well, no. The practical it's a first order concern, right? Let's say I would say that like I really want to get a promotion at my job and fuck Becky. I hate her. Let's say Becky gets into a car accident. I wouldn't have any more responsibility there just because I wanted Becky gone and I want to get the promotion. That would be Becky got a car accident. That's all on her. Even if I wanted Becky dead, I didn't have anything to do with it. That was Becky that did it. Same thing with the United States. Maybe it is the case that you're right and Biden was looking for some slippery way to fuck Russia. And we're going to foment change in Russia, Orange Revolution, whatever the fuck. We're going to get him out of there, right? Maybe that was an idea of the United States, but we didn't have to do it. Russia did it all on their own. They invaded Ukraine, 100% their decision, 100% their prerogative, and now all of the consequences that are dominoing from that are on them. You can't say that just because the United States might have in the future done something or they wished Russia would have a regime change, that it's their fault if it does end up happening because of Russia's mistakes.
Okay, but let's say the United States president does seek to enact policies with the ultimate ambition of bringing about the overthrow of the Russian government. And let's say he succeeds in doing so, meaning his desired objective is achieved.
Yep.
I mean, how do we then,
So the question would be, what are the policies? Yeah, easily. We would say, what are the policies that the United States had to effect regime change?
Describe that in like, I would like to be. Well, I mean, it's fine to have like a moral discussion over like what deserves blame or doesn't in this calculus or in this sort of scenario. But I would like to just establish kind of on analytical grounds or something. What actually happened, what actions were taken, what were the causes of them, and the United States president seeking to take policy action to overthrow a government, that's a pretty significant action because of the power of the United States. So I
agree. But then the question would be,
without like then saying, oh, that means you're like absolving Putin of blame for something.
Sure, I'm just saying that the question would be, what are the objectionable U.S. policies that took place then? That would be the question. And so far, I can't find
objectionable policies.
Yeah, like what did the U.S. do that it's like
to Ukraine?
What? Yeah, like has the U.S. done anything that's like, fuck, they're only doing that because they're trying to get rid of Putin? And I disagree with that policy because I don't see any. And I generally probably would be. Like, for instance, when it comes to Syria, I would take issue with the United States supplying rebel groups in Syria to get rid of Assad. I don't think that was the right way to do that. And I can point to, and that wasn't just because the FSA and the Kurds and these other people were fighting in Syria. That was because of direct U.S. involvement. I can point to a policy and say, the U.S. shipping weapons through Turkey to the FSA, that was not good. I don't approve of that. But when it comes to the Russia stuff. What has the USA done where it's like that's a policy disagreement or an action the U.S. engaged in that I disagree with insofar as Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the one that I most straightforwardly object to, and this is why I totally disagree with the kind of list of lessons you think that Biden has successfully internalized from Iraq and Afghanistan, is an utter lack of transparency on key issues. I mean, you say that, and if there it has been transparency, it wasn't a function of them selectively dropping intel prior to the invasion. That was information warfare. I'm not saying that as a conspiracy theorist. That's how the government itself described it in terms of what the strategy was. So it wasn't like they weren't doing that as some kind of transparency tactic, because for all we know, they have reams of additional intelligence that they didn't put out, right?
Sure. Well, but I mean, like, what is the transparency failing that we had, right? Because it feels like we're voting on all, like, these packages are all being voted on in Congress. Like, we're being pretty, it's not like we're...
Well, I mean, there's hardly any real debate at all on these aid packages. I mean, did you see a robust floor debate on the House of Representatives when they passed the latest round? What was it, September 28th?
Yeah, but is the lack of debate a lack of transparency, or does it show a unity of, like, Americans in terms of, like, yeah, we support this, like, let's go?
Well, I mean, I guess the lack of transparency that I'm talking about here, it really is related to mission creep. Seriously, because, like, I mean, the level of commitment that the U.S. now bears with regard to Ukraine, where somehow, our civilizational fate hinges on, the Donbass. I'm sorry, that was not communicated to the country by Biden or anyone else in a position of power in February to justify the initiation of the military intervention. And that once and why the initiation phase of the military intervention has to be as maximally transparent as possible is because once you initiate something, it's hard to ever really reel it back, or it has
what did you think
on a life of its own.
Right? I mean, what were we supporting Ukraine to do?
It's just like when you enact some like social provision program, like a welfare state program, you never really can reel it back because it gets ingrained and it kind of builds up inertia and so forth. And it's very similar with the huge U.S. military project.
Let's be really clear. Operation. What was the initial U.S. mission for Ukraine? My understanding was that it was going to be to supply them with as many arms as possible for them to resist Russia in whatever way possible.
Well, no, I mean, Biden would always be very. I mean, he was criticized by some Republicans for this and Democrats. He was always, purporting to be very careful and limited and circumscribed in the amount of armament that he would provide. I mean, he renounced that he was just going to like open the stockpiles and send everything needed. It was going to be very limited, modest, quote, defensive aid just to like help civilians who are under attack. I mean,
no
that's what they said.
Way.
That's the way it was portrayed by Biden in the initial phase. Go look it up.
The Russian invasion, this was in, what was this, like February?
Biden did not say in February that, by June, we're basically going to be subsidizing a brand new military long-range rocket systems.
We literally, hold on, in March, we were already sending them like $1 billion in weapons. Like it was on March.
There was aid underway.
What?
There was aid underway, but that the escalation in the aid in conjunction with the invasion.
Well, I mean, obviously the aid is going to escalate as the conflict escalates. But I'm just saying that like already in March, not even a month after Russia invaded, we literally sent them almost $1 billion in weapons. I don't think it was ever a plan to be chill and scaled back. My understanding is we were going to support them right up until the United States establishing a no-fly zone or having boots on the ground. But up until that, we were going to help them as much as possible.
That really was not what was conveyed initially. It was if anything, Biden emphasized what was supposed to be like the modesty and the restraint of the intervention. To be responsible, to not overly antagonize, Russia, to only do it with.
But that's only in regards
to provide for like the defense of civilians. So I mean, for example, if you look at like the public justification for the intervention in late February, early March, nothing that Biden or any top administration officials said, at least as far as I can recollect, and I'm open to being wrong if something contradicts this. I don't have a photographic memory, but nothing that was said at that time would have reflected that by August or September, the amount of quote aid, and again, it's a misnomer. It's military armament that's been provided already to this point, with no end in sight to Ukraine, dwarfs anything that the U.S. has done in terms of provision of such aid since the Vietnam War, and it's even about to dwarf the Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously the U.S. spent a ton more on Vietnam than it would have on Ukraine, but in terms of like the actual like military aid provided to the South Vietnamese government, Ukraine is now dwarfing it, right? So that's a really striking, jarring military commitment that the U.S. is making to Ukraine. And if that's going to be the nature of the commitment, the terms of it ought to be spelled out for the public to evaluate, rather than just like having this whole like euphoria thing that happened when the war broke out, where no one was really reasonably debating anything, and they were just kind of emoting.
Well, I feel like our response is going to be.
I think it's not honest in terms of like what was actually being pursued in practice by dint of the policy that had been enacted.
I don't think anybody ever expected us to send. I think, well, the honest expectation is, even with U.S. help, I think most people expected Kyiv to fall in 2 weeks. I think even with help in the West. But like, if it is the case that
the CIA put out, I mean, I'm not sold. I'm not sure what the story is behind this exactly, but yeah, the CIA did put out projections to that effect. Now, what the actual story behind those projections is, I think the
whole world expected Ukraine to fall.
I didn't know what to expect, because war is very unpredictable. So how the hell would I know?
Well, the whole world. Hold on. The whole world expected
the CIA leaked something.
The whole world expected Iraq to fall when the U.S. invaded, and they did. The whole world expected Libya to fall, for Serbians to get destroyed by NATO. Forever, things generally happen. Generally,
I have no clue. I mean, I have.
Sure, I'm just saying that you have like
hubristic for me to like have a firm, solid expectation about what's going to happen. I mean, I've never seen the Russian military invade Ukraine. Like, so how would I know? I mean,
I'm just saying that I'm not saying we know 100%, because obviously no one knew. I mean, that's kind of the story of this conflict, right? But I'm just saying, I think the expectation was that Ukraine is going to get crushed pretty quickly. I think most people expected that. But if it was the case that Ukraine managed to hold out for some weeks or months, right? I don't think that there was ever going to be a point where we're like, okay, well, we're done supporting you guys. Good luck. Now Russia's going to take over. I don't think that was ever in the cards.
How about this though, right? Yeah. So when the war did first start, Biden said no reason for anybody to even have any concern whatsoever about nuclear weapons, not even on our radar. Don't worry. I mean, even worrying about it at all is sort of like a unwarranted sort of capitulation in a way to Putin. So just block it out of your mind. And then, October rolls around, and Biden himself is warning of nuclear Armageddon. Now,
hold on. I don't know if Biden's warning it. Isn't this just because Putin has said it? Isn't that just because Putin is the one that's bringing this out now as a conversation topic? I don't know if that's Biden's fault. I think it's
not solely because of that. It's because, well, I mean,
I don't think if Putin didn't bring it up, we wouldn't be talking about it, right?
So you don't think it's relevant that for 8 months or whatever, the U.S. has been operationally coordinating and subsidizing almost single-handedly the war effort against the country with the world's largest nuclear arsenal, that being Russia? You don't think that's a relevant factor as to why the threat level has escalated?
It might be, but then we go back to that other question that you haven't answered. Well, but then the other question was that what are the rules then for the world? If you have a nuclear force, are you allowed to be infinitely belligerent to your neighbors? It feels like the answer to that can't be yes. I don't feel like it can be. Maybe you do, but I feel like the answer to that can't be yes. That can't be the way that the world works.
Well, I mean, the way that the world basically does work, as far as I can discern, and I'm not the world's leading expert on this, kind of mockingly, on the Call-In app where I have the sort of interactive podcast thing, I call it facetiously gathering of experts with experts in scare quotes, because I kind of and had enough of experts. I guess, as far as what I've been able to glean, the way the world quote works is that the countries with the most power in the international system, which for quite some time now has been the United States, they more or less just dictate what the rules are, and those dictations tend to be presented as in keeping or with some sort of international relations style program about the rules-based order and all this, and a lot of I would say largely pablum is propagated to kind of justify the construction of these rules, but ultimately the source of the rulemaking is pure power, right?
Sure, but again, that's not my. That's
So in light of that, and like in light of like the sort of chaos that implies, if it's just like a function of who has power, then I think people drastically overrate the amount of like good, or the amount of like amount that is like predictably good that can arise from any any military intervention at all. I mean, this probably even applies to Russia in a sense. I mean, something seems to have gone awry with at least portions of their war planning, right? Because war is like an inherently like just insane enterprise. And yeah, the U.S. is engaged in warfare. It's engaged when it first started the arms provision program, even just as early as February, March. It had already become the biggest arms provision program that, in Europe since Truman started sending arms to Greece and Turkey. So it was already it was unprecedented from basically the moment it was launched. But like the gravity of it or the significance of it has been consistently downplayed, because if you play it up too much, that helps Putin, or you're degrading the agencies of Ukraine, or you're doing all kinds of other like malevolent things that somehow prevent you from just like honestly describing reality, which I kind of object to.
But I'm gonna ask again, what are the rules then? If you are a nuclear power, do you just get to infinitely invade countries and take their territory? Because that seems to be the logical extension of what you're saying. Well, and that's what Russia's relying on for their foreign policy. We've got nukes, therefore we're allowed to take what we want.
I mean, if I could personally make the rules, I mean, rule number one would be to abolish all nuclear weapons. But
we can't do that right now, right? So here we are with the world as it is, and we are in a position now to be critical or supportive of U.S. foreign policy or foreign policy in general, internationally. And now the question is, Russia has taken over parts of a country, and Russia has waved the nuclear flag from day one, saying, well, if you fuck with us, there might be nuclear war. So do we as the rest of the world say, okay, fine, you can take that? Or do we say, no, we have to make a clear stand here and say, just because you have nuclear weapons doesn't mean you're allowed to bully the rest of the world. We have to draw a line in the sand. This can't be the way the world works. Because it sucks that there is a dichotomy here, but we kind of have to do one or the other, because there is no James Bond to disable all the nuclear weapons. There is no Tom Clancy to shut down the nuclear silos. Like, this is what we have. We have a nuclear power invading another country saying, we're going to take some of your shit. And now we on the West have to decide, do we support this country with everything we have to say, no, you can't do that? Or do we acquiesce and say, oh, fuck, if you've got nukes, I guess you can steal shit from other countries?
I guess, my foundational skepticism in the utility of U.S. military intervention in particular, because I'm what I'm most familiar with, and even my examination of what this current U.S. military intervention has consisted of, it compels me to decline to say that I'm willing to just endorse the use of this military force to achieve this desired outcome that you say is going to be achieved by like our counter appeasement approach. I don't know that there's much good evidence that it will, it's bearing like the good, benevolent outcomes that people sort of assume it does.
Well, I think
there's been a lot of credulity about this intervention. There's been like a moral prohibition on really doing any kind of adversarial.
This is a very rare case though, where we do have evidence of the counterfactual, because the counterfactual is I say appease Russia, because in I think it was in 91 in Moldova, Russia did the same thing of declaring an independent territory in Transnistria, and they stole that.
And that's not a counterfactual. I mean, because
but I'm saying this.
Russia was like a collapsed state.
But they did it, and they did the same thing from 2004 and 2008 in Georgia, where they peeled off territory. So they did do that, and nobody opposed them, right? And now they're going over to Ukraine. So what I'm saying is, we've already got the blueprint for Transnistria. We saw it happen with Azkaban and South Ossetia in Georgia, and now we're seeing it happen again for the third time in Ukraine. So at some point, we got to stop and say, okay, well, fuck. What if it happens with like Azerbaijan next? Are you going to be saying, okay, hold on. Now, they can't do this in Azerbaijan. Are you going to go, well, fuck, if we do anything here, it might escalate to nuclear war? Because if we're on the third loop now, it seems like at some point we need to be able to say, okay, fuck, this can't be allowed to happen anymore, right? Abkhazia is the name of the other.
Can't be allowed to happen anymore. Okay, so if you're going to, stand up and declare this cannot be allowed to happen anymore. What does that mean? Initiate
that
armed conflict?
It means that we support a country as much as we can.
Then no, I'm not going to be just mindlessly avowing support for that, given what
Hold on, it's not mindless.
The nature of initiations of armed conflict.
It's not mindless. It's incredibly strategic and deliberate. It's not a mindless thing. It's basically saying that, like, okay, well, if you're going to initiate armed conflict against sovereign states, just because you've got nukes doesn't mean we're not going to oppose you up until doing everything we can to avoid a nuclear conflict, which the United States, by not committing actual physical troops to the situation, is attempting to do, which is why I said initially I feel like Biden is doing what I would argue is the most responsible thing we can do, because I would argue that a future where territories are allowed to conquer each other, insofar as long as they have nuclear weapons, is a more nuclear-prone world. That's a world where nuclear conflict is more likely to happen because more countries are going to be pursuing nuclear weapons, and then therefore more countries are going to be likely to have to use them to either defend themselves or attack other countries. And that's the future that I would want to avoid. So in a way, I feel like appeasement is like the worst of all worlds, because Russia gets what they want again for a third time, and we still have more likely to have like nuclear conflict in the future.
Well, I mean, the so-called strategic logic of why it would be good for the U.S. to like initiate, I don't know, some kind of preemptive armed conflict against Russia because this is our last stand and we're not going to stand for appeasement anymore, so therefore I don't know, what are we going to do, bomb Moscow? I mean, that's why, like,
no, we're going to supply arms to Ukraine so they can resist as much as they can. Right?
Okay, well, I mean, the strategic logic of that, which has been repeated over and over again, I mean, I like to see evidence that it's something. There's been a positive effect. I don't know. It seems like
the positive effect so far is Ukraine has been able to assert its territorial sovereignty. That's one thing which Ukraine is doing, which is positive. But the second thing is that if we look,
Putin annexed territories.
He had already had Crimea for 8 years.
Right. So there's been no change really in Ukraine's inability.
Well, the change now is Russia might be losing Crimea back to Ukraine. So that's a positive change, right?
Might be.
I mean, well,
things that might happen in the interim, like everybody gets blown up.
I mean, a year ago, the question was, it might be the case that Ukraine doesn't exist anymore and it becomes part of the nation state of fucking Belarus and Russia. So
it might be the case. I mean, we don't know.
Sure, but I would argue that the situation we're at right now, insofar as the security situation in Ukraine, has improved. I think Ukrainians are happier now than they were.
Has it?
Absolutely.
I mean, Putin just launched the biggest, countrywide airstrikes.
Putin is literally drafting citizens that are like killing recruiters because they're so unhappy with the military conflict.
So, I mean, has the security situation improved?
For Ukraine, yes. Ukraine literally went from, like, 7 months ago, it was like, I don't know if Kiev is going to fall in 2 weeks, to now, I don't know if Russia can hold on to Crimea. That has been an incredible turnaround, of course.
Okay, you're saying the security situation improved. Meanwhile, on Monday of this week, Putin unleashed, in retaliation for the, what I think is just straightforwardly, definitionally, it was a terror bombing of the Crimea Bridge, 4 civilians, deliberately killed. And Putin, retaliates for that and does the nationwide airstrikes, including in even some places that hadn't been attacked in the initial phase of the war, like in the center city, Kiev, as far as I understand it.
No. Kiev has already been bombed. There are videos of people
that portion of it hadn't been. That portion of it hadn't been.
But I mean, like, look at Mariupol. We've already seen children and women and men raped and killed. We've already seen war crimes being committed.
So where's the evidence for the great outcome here? I mean, I see a lot of bad outcomes.
Because you only see the bad outcome right now in front of you, that there's a little bit of a cost. But that's like saying there's a bad outcome in the Revolutionary War in the United States and that Americans or British people are dying while they're fighting for a revolution. But the outcome to that was the United States existed. The 13 colonies became the US of A. We declared our independence from Great Britain or England or whatever the fuck, right? And then we made a country. But it's always going to get a little worse before it gets better. But right now, your alternative peaceful scenario is Ukraine doesn't exist. It's a puppet state to Russia.
Okay, well, let me give you an alternative that isn't really even mine. I mean, I watched the UN Security Council meeting that would happen this week, and what China and India proposed. I mean, I know people think China is like the ground zero for all evil or something now, but let's just go with India. What India proposed is what they have proposed from the outset, as have countless other countries. I mean, the U.S. is really unique, in conjunction with, Britain and then other parts of, the EU. But in terms of much of the rest of the world, they've been virtually unanimous in affirming what India affirmed once more at this latest UN Security Council, which is that
Before you get into what India says, keep in mind that India right now is literally rewriting rules to make it so that Indian citizens can buy territory and land permanently in the region of Kashmir that is contested with Pakistan, that's another nuclear power. So India is in and of themselves involved in a nuclear conflict almost with Pakistan fighting over territory to the north. So if you're going to tell me that India is a really good solution for Ukraine, that's funny, but there's literally been worries of escalation, nuclear escalation between India and Pakistan. So holy shit. Right?
I'm not talking about anything that India is doing other than what its ambassadors present to the United Nations as their view on the Ukraine conflict. That's all I'm
but I'm just saying that even India is involved in their own territorial disputes. So I would take what they would say with a grain of salt, right?
Okay, well, take it with a grain of salt, but in terms of like what they actually said and what they've said all along, and so have many, many other countries. I mean, forget India then. South Africa says the same thing. Go with South Africa. What they say is that the priority in Ukraine should be to bring about an immediate ceasefire, cessation of hostilities, and urgent resources put behind a diplomatic outcome that rationally takes into account both sides, because the violence has to end. More humanitarian aid should be deployed, and so basically, what India and China and all these other countries, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, I mean, you name it, Pakistan. Well, I'm not saying those are they're perfect countries in terms of all their other policies, right? I'm saying in terms of their attitude toward the Ukraine conflict, they've been diametrically opposite to the U.S. because the U.S. from the outset, because it's had this military operation that everybody says we must do because we're standing with Ukraine, that's been to the explicit exclusion of even pretending like any kind of diplomatic solution could be even pursued, or even that cessation of hostilities was even a priority.
Yeah, because diplomacy is not
it seems like if you're actually concerned about the welfare of people in a war, you would probably want the warfare to cease, but that's not what the U.S. has wanted.
No, because diplomacy is not an option.
That was never entertained by the U.S. because they took action every step of the way to not just continue the war, but to intensify and escalate the war to the point that now we're in a new escalatory phase.
Diplomacy is not an option while Russia...
Major countries like India have been presenting an alternative all along. It's just been ignored.
No, because diplomacy is not an option while Russia is controlling enemy territory. That's like, have you ever played like grand strategy games like Civ 4?
Says who?
Says who? Says Ukraine. It's there. It's at the rest of the world. It's not. It doesn't count as diplomacy when you say, okay, you stole my shit, you can keep it, and now we're at peace now. That's the goal. That in a lot of video games you play, that's the goal, is to beat your opponent up so much that you take some of their land and then you sue for peace. It's like, oh cool, I got your shit, I win. Right? That's not diplomacy. That's like Ukraine wants to fight. That's their country.
It's amazing because before 2022. It wasn't like this article of faith in American liberalism that somehow, when you reach a certain geopolitical scenario, that's when we're faced with the utter impossibility of diplomacy, and therefore it's only military solutions that could be advisable. Actually, that would have been seen as a much more right-wing or hawk view, for much of the past 20 years. But all of a sudden today, it's liberals and leftists saying diplomacy. What? I mean, only military solutions are ever going to be available to us right now, and that's why we need to pour ever more, rockets and heavy artillery and everything else into this war zone. Because diplomacy, I mean, that seems like a bit fascist to do diplomacy.
That's unfortunately, no, hold on. That's these. None of these are good faith arguments. Okay, the issue is not that like
I was being a little exaggerated. It was
sure, I know, but like the issue is like we should always pursue diplomacy. But once the other side has brought out, once the other side has brought out its swords, well, now it's time to fight, right? You don't want to start a conflict, but you don't want to lose them if somebody else starts one with you. So I agree diplomacy is important. And you know what? Diplomacy could be on the table, but here's a question to you. Do you think that Russia would accept a diplomatic end that involves them not controlling Crimea?
I don't know.
Well, that's a really important question to ask, because you're putting the onus of a wait. You're putting. I just want to say You're putting all of the diplomatic onus on the West to find a solution, but the only solution that Putin would be happy with is one where they maintain control of Crimea. That's not a fair diplomatic end to Ukraine. I'm willing to bet, and I'll PayPal you $1,000 if I'm wrong, okay? But I'm willing to bet that if there was a deal on the table,
where the charity,
where Putin, I'll send it to Ukrainian trader, okay? Hopefully it doesn't.
Actually, send it to me. Forget the charity.
Okay, sure, fuck it. Okay, if there was a deal on the table where Ukraine said, listen, give us back Crimea, get the fuck out of the Donbass, and we'll be chill, I don't think Putin would accept that deal.
I mean, I'm not, again, not trying to evade. I honestly don't know. I don't have like a basis on which to have a.
Well, if he would accept the deal, why wouldn't he just give up Crimea and move on? Because nothing would shift the world opinion faster than if Ukraine were to invade Russia. That would be fun, right?
But hold on. I mean, the posture. So there was actually some sort of negotiation underway at the early phase of the war that was being mediated by Turkey. So it actually was bilateral between Ukraine and Russia. Now,
well, the agreement for what though?
For a ceasefire,
but with Russia keeping Crimea, because that's not a fair That's not a fair end.
Well, but
that's literally what Ukraine is fighting over.
Hold on, no, it wasn't. That was tentatively agreed to as of March. But then, because the war aims vastly expanded as the war dragged on, now that's no longer tenable. I mean, Zelensky wasn't demanding in February when the invasion started, to put an end to this, we have to now somehow seize Crimea.
Because Crimea wasn't, because they didn't even know, because Zelensky didn't even know his country was going to exist in 2 weeks. Right? But the status has changed, and now the possibility of having their own land that they rightfully own, now that possibility is back on the table. So yeah, why wouldn't they push for that?
Sure. Well, I mean, what I'm saying is when there was apparently and the details are sketchy. I mean, talk about lack of transparency.
There is no lack of. You keep saying lack of transparency. I'm not saying it, but okay, go ahead.
Well, there's a lack of transparency about what I'm about to describe to you, which is that we have like very vague hints and leaks from former U.S. officials, which is how these get put out there in increments. Fiona Hill, who was like in the Trump administration, was like a Russia hawk. Did an essay in July or August of this year where she said, there was a deal. Based on her sources in the government, she says, and she's not a journalist, so I mean you have to like read it with some remove. But she says that there was actually a viable quote unquote deal on the table in late March, early April, mediated by Turkey in Istanbul between representatives from both Russia and Ukraine for a ceasefire. It would have included some sort of like potential affirmation of Ukraine for neutrality, and it would have involved withdrawal by Russia to the pre-February 24th borders, so wouldn't have involved Crimea. I mean, according to this agreement that both were apparently on board with. And then, one thing led to another, and Biden starts accusing Putin of genocide. The whole negotiation gets blown up. I still don't know if we have the full details of it. Fiona Hill sort of alludes to the U.S. and Britain kind of maybe had a role in vetoing that potential agreement. We don't know.
Sure.
I would like more transparency because there's not been a whole lot on whatever happened there. So the idea that Crimea was always like somehow the central issue on which the resolution or lack thereof of the conflict hinged. It's just not. It wasn't the case even during an earlier point of the conflict, according to an agreement that was again partaken in by both Russia and Ukraine. So that's the thing. The longer a war, if the U.S. sought to protract the war, hence the escalation of the armament. Yeah,
we want to protracting the war is good because we want Ukraine to have its original borders from 1991.
And I'm not sold on protracting a war being good because of the unpredictability of what flows from protracting a war.
But then when we say that though,
is all of a sudden it's an impossibility to have any kind of ceasefire or diplomatic arrangement at all.
Sure, but now we're back at
is okay. Let's do what's reasonably within our power to probably cease the warfare and cease people getting killed needlessly. And now that's not even on the table.
Well, I was going to say, but now we're back at the original question then of, okay, then if you have nuclear arms, should you be allowed to infinitely bully other countries? And that, I feel like the answer to that has to be no. But I'm going to give you because I feel like we're kind of, I'll give you the last one. Yeah, go for it if you want to. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, look, I mean, a lot of and people think there's something suspicious about this, I guess, or they infer ulterior motives where I'm like, I love Putin or a fascist or Nazi, blah blah blah, because my basic predilection in evaluating this whole issue has been to primarily look at what U.S. policy is, and I'm not saying that's the only angle anyone can look at it from, but I'm a U.S. citizen. I have a fairly well-developed knowledge of how the U.S. government works and the foreign policy apparatus, and I can go and look at. I mean, I went to Poland myself and looked at the proxy war architecture I've talked to, interviewed senators and congressmen about it, and think tank people, and former ambassadors, and stuff. So like that's how I can it seems I can best approach the conflict in a way that's most like illuminating or most revealing. And so because scrutinizing U.S. policy along those lines gets read or coded by some as like denunciation of U.S. policy, or like this moral judgment, or even it's even construed often as like I'm specifically attempting to enable the genocide of Ukraine. People get really crazed with this stuff because like war makes people crazy, both sides. Not doing both sidism, it just happens to be the case that war makes people crazy. And so, for example, and just to stop, I don't want to go on a huge field because we go on forever. I enjoyed the conversation, but so if the ultimate sort of like question is, should countries be allowed to do what they want if they have a nuclear arsenal and invade countries? I mean, I'm not sure how to answer that in as an abstraction. I'm more interested. Maybe it's just because of like a journalistic impulse on like the factual and the verifiable and the empirical and like what's on the record, what can actually be examined tangibly. And, so that's more what I'm more inclined to like present a firm view on rather than something that's more speculative. So like one thing just to close out here that is actually tangible that happened and is in the record now historically is that just a couple of days ago, Biden, doing this interview on CNN with Jake Tapper, just explicitly renounces. He issues a renunciation right to Jake Tapper's face that he will engage in any negotiations with Putin. Now, I mean, we talked about the Iraq War earlier. When I was growing up, I mean, the whole like liberal critique of Bush was that he flouted diplomacy, right? He was too willing to use military solutions, right? And that's bad. That was kind of the basic liberal critique of Bush, more or less. And that critique has just been vaporized. I don't know what happened to it. People think that favoring diplomacy over military brinksmanship is now, I don't know, secretly pro-Nazi or whatever. I mean, everything now has gotten so haywire that really it's very difficult to have any kind of rational conversation, which actually is why I appreciate the, I think, reasonably rational conversation that we've had. So thanks for having me past.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, obviously I disagree, but I appreciate the conversation. It's been fun to hammer it out. It's not often I get to talk like foreign policy with anybody. So yeah, thanks a lot. I appreciate the conversation. Yeah. It's been fun.
All right. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. Have a good one, dude. I'll see you later. Peace out.
Bye-bye.